I watched my own daughter laugh as her husband shoved me into a burning grill. My flesh blistered against the scorching metal, while 18 of their wealthy friends stood by and did absolutely nothing. They thought they were getting rid of a helpless old man to steal my home. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who owned their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Hollis. I am 70 years old. I survived 3 decades as a master electrician and a union boss in Chicago. I worked my hands to the bone buying up abandoned industrial lots in the 80s, building a massive commercial real estate fortune that I kept completely hidden. I lived modestly to avoid the toxic greed of modern society. My daughter Kendra grew up with strict morals, but she abandoned every single one of them the moment she married Jared. The thick smell of seared ribeye steaks mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of Jared's expensive cologne. He stood on the brick patio I had laid with my own hands 30 years ago. 18 of his affluent friends milled about my backyard drinking imported beer and laughing at jokes I could not hear. Jared held a pair of steel tongs in one hand and a crystal glass in the other. He wore a designer linen shirt paid for by the credit cards I had secretly helped my daughter clear twice. I approached the grill to check the temperature of the meat. Jared stepped squarely into my path, completely blocking the heat. He did not look at the food. He looked down at me with a cold and impatient glare. He leaned in close so the guests could not hear his exact words, but his tone was undeniably sharp. He told me the deed transfer papers were sitting on the kitchen island. He demanded I go inside and sign my property over to his real estate development company before dessert was served. He claimed his contractors needed full access to my land by Monday morning to start demolishing my garage for his new project. I looked past his shoulder. Kendra stood a few feet away sipping a bright cocktail with her friends. She heard the edge in his voice. She saw him corner me. She simply turned her head and took another sip. I turned my attention back to the man standing in my backyard. I kept my voice steady and firm. I told him I was not transferring the deed of my home to his corporate account. I stated clearly that this was my property and it would remain my property. Jared's face tightened. The polite mask he wore for his wealthy friends dropped completely, revealing the arrogant predator underneath. He took a step forward, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice into a vicious whisper. He told me I was a 70-year-old man living alone in a house I could no longer maintain. He accused me of stalling his development project out of pure spite and old-age stubbornness. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eye and corrected him. I told him I was living in the house I bought with blood and sweat, and no developer was going to pave over my history. Jared shoved me. It was not a tap or an accidental bump. It was a hard, deliberate push against my chest with his free hand. I lost my footing on the slick, wet brick of the patio. I fell backward, my balance betraying me. I threw my right arm out to stop my fall. My hand slammed directly onto the scorching cast iron edge of the hot grill. The pain was instantaneous and absolutely blinding. My flesh hissed violently against the searing metal. The smell of burning skin filled the air, cutting through the aroma of the barbecue. I gritted my teeth, swallowing the scream that tore at my throat. I yanked my hand back and clutched it to my chest, feeling the skin bubble and peel away. My heart hammered against my ribs. The physical agony radiated up my arm, but it was entirely eclipsed by the shock of the assault. I looked up at the man who had married my daughter. He stood tall, holding his tongs, not an ounce of regret in his eyes. He had intentionally assaulted an elderly man in his own backyard to force a real estate deal. He believed his physical dominance and his financial facade gave him the absolute right to break me. He believed I was fragile. The patio went dead silent. 18 guests stopped talking and stared directly at me. Not a single person stepped forward to offer a hand. No one asked if I was injured. Jared let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed across the yard. He raised his glass to the crowd and announced that I had just tripped over my own feet. He told his friends that my balance was completely shot these days and I needed to watch my step. I looked at Kendra. I expected my own flesh and blood to run to my side. I expected her to scream at her husband for putting his hands on her father. Instead, she walked over slowly, set her cocktail down on a glass table, and looked at me with profound annoyance. She did not ask about my bleeding hand. She crossed her arms and told me I was being incredibly selfish. She accused me of ruining her party and throwing a tantrum in front of her important guests. She told me I was only making the property transition harder for everyone involved. She ordered me to go inside, put some ice on my wrist, and just sign the papers so they could move on with their lives. She turned her back to me and walked away. A few guests chuckled, shaking their heads as if I were a stubborn toddler refusing to go to bed. I looked down at my blistered, agonizing hand. I did not yell at my daughter. I did not curse at the man who burned me. I wrapped my hand tightly in a cloth napkin, turned around, and walked through the side gate. I got into my rusted truck and drove away from the house without looking back. My silence was not submission. I did not drive to the emergency room to treat my burns. I drove directly to my private residence across town. I walked straight into my locked study to check my personal safe. I needed to ensure my foundational documents were secure before I launched my retaliation. I found the heavy steel door of the safe hanging open. The lock had been violently drilled out. My private files were scattered across the floor. They thought they had secured their victory by breaking into my life. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them entirely. I drove 30 miles past the city limits. I bypassed the shiny local hospitals where neighborhood gossip travels faster than the emergency ambulances. I parked my rusted truck outside a sterile, anonymous urgent care clinic in a neighboring county. The waiting room smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stale coffee. When the nurse finally called my name, I walked into the examination room with my right hand wrapped tightly in the blood-spotted cloth napkin. The attending physician, a young man with exhausted eyes, carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage. He physically winced at the sight of the blistering charred flesh stretching across my palm and fingers. He reached immediately for his prescription pad to write an aggressive order for heavy narcotics. I reached out and grabbed his wrist with my good hand. I told him I did not want any painkillers. I needed my mind razor sharp and my senses completely unimpaired for the impending confrontation. I demanded one specific item from him. I needed a certified medical report explicitly documenting a third-degree thermal burn caused directly by physical assault. The doctor looked at me, assessing the grim, unyielding determination in my posture. He asked if I wanted him to contact the local police department to file a formal assault charge against the perpetrator. I declined his offer firmly. I explained that a standard police report would only alert the enemy before I had the trap properly set. I needed undeniable, admissible medical evidence bound by strict legal documentation. He nodded, cleaned the severe wound, meticulously wrapped it in medical-grade gauze, and printed the exact certification I requested. He stamped the paperwork with the clinic's official seal. I folded the heavy document and slid it into my breast pocket. The pain radiating up my forearm was intense, a steady, vicious throb of burning nerve endings. I welcomed the agony. It served as a perfect, constant, physical reminder of the betrayal I was about to violently dismantle. This certified paper was the first concrete weapon in my legal arsenal. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. The street was entirely quiet. Jared and Kendra had already cleared out, taking their affluent friends back to their fabricated reality in the city. The backyard was a disastrous wasteland of half-empty beer bottles and discarded expensive plates, a perfect testament to their absolute disregard for my property and my presence. I ignored the mess and walked straight through the kitchen, heading directly down the hall to my private study. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and knelt beside the bottom drawer of my solid mahogany desk. The false bottom concealed a heavy steel lockbox where I kept my foundational documents and corporate ledgers. The moment I pulled the drawer open, the true, desperate extent of their invasion became undeniably clear. The thick steel latch was utterly destroyed. It had been violently forced open with a heavy flathead screwdriver. Deep, jagged gouges scarred the polished wood of the desk. Jared had not merely broken into a metal box. He had desecrated the only private sanctuary I possessed in this world. I sifted through the violated contents with my uninjured left hand. My birth certificate, old property deeds, and financial records from my days as a union boss were aggressively shuffled and tossed aside in his frantic search for the current house deed. But arrogant men always make fatal, sloppy mistakes when they operate in a state of blind panic. Hidden beneath a thick stack of my outdated medical records, I spotted a heavy manila envelope. The return address, printed in bold black ink, belonged to a notorious high-risk commercial lending firm based out of state. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed directly to Jared's premier real estate development company. He must have carried it in his jacket, using my safe as a temporary dumping ground while tearing through my files. He completely forgot he dropped it in his manic rush to confront me at the grill outside. I pulled the stiff legal documents from the envelope. The paper felt like absolute poison in my hand. I spread the pages across my desk and turned on the brass reading lamp. I was no longer looking at a simple invasion of privacy. I was looking at the exact blueprint of his financial execution. The first page was a brutal final notice of default. Jared's flashy real estate development company was entirely bankrupt. He owed a staggering $2 million on a commercial bridge loan. He had leveraged his entire hollow empire on a massive downtown development project that had spectacularly failed months ago. But the subsequent pages revealed the true depth of his criminal desperation. Attached to the final default notice was a highly fraudulent collateral agreement. 3 months ago, Jared had forged my personal signature. He had illegally pledged my residential home as the primary collateral to secure an emergency extension on his failing business loan. Decades ago, I spent 30 years working double shifts as a master electrician, crawling through freezing industrial construction sites to secure this exact property free and clear. Jared had attempted to steal that lifetime of legacy with a cheap ballpoint pen. The commercial bank was threatening immediate, unyielding foreclosure. Federal bank auditors were officially scheduled to arrive on Monday morning to verify the physical collateral. The timeline snapped into brutal, clear focus. Jared did not want my house to build a new luxury project. He needed the physical deed transferred to his company's name today, so he could quickly liquidate the property to a cash buyer. I was frantically attempting to cover his criminal tracks before the federal auditors discovered the massive wire fraud he had committed. My daughter knew. Kendra had to know the strict deadline. She stood on my patio and watched me burn because protecting her fake affluent lifestyle was vastly more important than protecting her own father from a federal crime. The sharp vibration of my cell phone broke the absolute silence of the study. The screen lit up with a text message from Kendra. The words were sterile, calculated, and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. She stated that Jared's personal attorney and a private medical doctor were coming to my house at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. She wrote that if I refused to sign the property deed over to Jared immediately, they were filing an emergency petition with the state to declare me mentally incompetent. She claimed my injury today was undeniable proof that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and I was a danger to myself. She ordered me to stop fighting them and accept the inevitable transition. They had established their timeline and chosen their battlefield. They fundamentally believed I was an isolated, uneducated old man easily bullied into submission. They were catastrophically wrong. I placed the phone down on the desk next to the forged collateral documents. I picked up my secure landline and dialed the private cell phone number of Mitchell Ross, the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. The phone rang twice before he answered. The time for silent endurance was officially over. It was exactly 5 in the morning when I walked into the expansive downtown office of my corporate attorney, Harvey. The city outside his floor-to-ceiling windows was still completely dark, a fitting backdrop for the ruthless business we needed to conduct. I bypassed the empty reception desk and stepped directly into his private suite. I placed 2 specific items on the center of his massive glass desk. The first was the certified medical report detailing the 3rd-degree thermal burn on my right hand. The second was the fraudulent default notice and collateral agreement I had pulled from my violated safe. Harvey picked up the medical report first. His eyes scanned the clinical description of the unprovoked physical assault. Then he picked up the banking documents. I watched the professional detachment drain from his face, replaced rapidly by a cold, calculating fury. Harvey and I had known each other for over 2 decades. He knew exactly how hard I had worked to secure my assets through grueling physical labor. He slammed the forged collateral agreement down on the glass. He told me this was a textbook case of blatant wire fraud, gross forgery, and aggravated elder abuse. He reached for his desk phone, declaring that we needed to contact the police immediately. He wanted Jared arrested before sunrise. He promised me he could have a squad car at my daughter's luxury apartment within the hour to drag my son-in-law out in handcuffs. The temptation to let him make that call was incredibly strong. The image of Jared being humiliated in front of his wealthy neighbors offered a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but I did not want a fleeting victory. I wanted absolute destruction. I reached across the desk with my uninjured hand and firmly pressed down on the receiver, disconnecting the line. I told Harvey that calling the police right now was the worst possible strategic move. I explained my reasoning with absolute clarity. If we filed a formal police report today, Jared would undoubtedly be arrested for the physical assault and the forgery. He would spend a few uncomfortable nights in a holding cell. However, the commercial bank holding that $2 million defaulted loan would not simply walk away. The moment a criminal investigation opened, the bank's aggressive legal team would immediately freeze my residential property. They would tie my home up in an endless civil litigation battle, desperate to recoup their massive financial losses by any means necessary. I would spend the remaining years of my life sitting in sterile courtrooms, paying exorbitant legal fees to prove a forgery to a judge while a bank held my house hostage. I refused to spend my retirement fighting a faceless financial institution over a crime I did not commit. I looked Harvey directly in the eyes. I demanded a surgical strike. I wanted my home completely cleared of any institutional claims, and I wanted my son-in-law to face the absolute crushing reality of his actions without any possibility of escape. I needed to let Jared dig his own grave so deep that neither his arrogant attitude nor his leveraged money could ever pull him out. Harvey slowly released his grip on the telephone. The furious lawyer retreated, and the ruthless corporate litigator stepped forward. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, assessing the cold determination in my voice. He understood exactly what I was asking for. We were not going to simply defend my assets. We were going to weaponize Jared's overwhelming greed against him. Harvey opened his laptop and securely logged into the state's commercial property database. The glow of the screen illuminated the sharp lines of his face as his fingers flew across the keyboard. He was hunting for the exact legal leverage we needed to execute my demand. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of keys. He pulled up the official chain of title for my residential address and reviewed the historical filings with a predator's focus. Harvey turned his laptop screen toward me. He pointed directly to the signature line on the fraudulent collateral agreement Jared had submitted to the bank 3 months ago. Jared had forged my personal signature. He had signed my legal name as an individual property owner. Harvey smiled, a sharp and predatory expression. He reminded me of a highly confidential transaction we executed 12 years ago, back when I was quietly expanding my commercial real estate portfolio and buying up those abandoned industrial lots. I transferred the deed of my primary residence into a blind corporate trust to protect my privacy and limit my tax liabilities. I named that trust Vanguard Holdings. The legal reality was brilliantly simple. The individual man sitting in this office did not actually own the house. Vanguard Holdings owned the house. Jared's forgery was completely legally impotent. I had pledged a massive piece of real estate using the forged signature of an individual who did not hold the title. The commercial bank had absolutely no valid claim to my property because their collateral documentation was fundamentally flawed from the moment it was signed. Jared's arrogant assumption that I was just a simple, uneducated, retired electrician had blinded him to the basic necessity of running a proper title search. He assumed my worn clothes and rusted truck meant I was financially illiterate. He never bothered to dig past the surface of my public identity. By relying entirely on his own superiority complex, he had handed us the key to his federal indictment. We now possessed the exact information required to destroy him. Harvey quickly opened a new document template. He drafted a dummy property transfer declaration perfectly formatted to look like a standard residential deed transfer. The plan was flawlessly ruthless. We were going to give my son-in-law exactly what he demanded. I would sign the physical paper transferring the deed using my individual name exactly as Jared requested. By allowing Jared to willingly submit this useless forged deed to a federally insured bank across state lines, we would elevate his desperate scheme into undeniable federal wire fraud. He would trap himself in a crime that carried mandatory prison time. I took the freshly printed documents from Harvey, folded them neatly, and placed them in my jacket pocket alongside the medical report. The trap was perfectly constructed. All it required was the arrogant rat to take the bait. I thanked Harvey, walked out of the towering office building, and got back into my rusted truck. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline. I drove back to my quiet neighborhood to patiently await my daughter's scheduled ambush. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed exactly 9 times. Before the final bell faded, the heavy brass deadbolt on my front door clicked open. I had not given them permission to enter, but Kendra still possessed the spare key I handed her 5 years ago, when she promised to always look after me. She walked into my living room first, wearing a designer trench coat, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Jared followed close behind, radiating a sickening aura of unearned victory. He did not come alone. 2 unfamiliar men trailed them like hired mercenaries. One man carried a heavy leather briefcase and immediately began spreading aggressive legal documents across my mahogany coffee table. The second man, wearing a cheap wrinkled suit and carrying a medical bag, took a seat in the corner armchair without uttering a single word. His presence was not subtle. I was the corrupt physician. Kendra had threatened me with via text message, sitting there perfectly ready to sign an involuntary psychiatric hold if I offered any physical or verbal resistance. Jared stood at the head of the coffee table and slapped his palm flat against the thick stack of papers. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a man who believed he had finally conquered his greatest obstacle. He treated my house like it was already an active construction site, pacing across the rug with his muddy shoes. They had orchestrated a complete home invasion masked as a legal intervention. I remained perfectly still in my chair, nursing my heavily bandaged right hand against my chest, playing the exact role of the terrified, cornered victim they fully expected to see. Jared leaned over the table and tapped a silver pen against the top document. He instructed me to stop wasting his valuable time and sign the deed transfer immediately. He declared with absolute arrogance that he had already secured a bed for me at a state-run assisted living facility on the industrial side of the city. He claimed the cheap facility was perfectly adequate for my deteriorating mental condition. He promised to arrange a moving truck by the end of the week to haul away whatever garbage I wanted to keep, stating the rest of my belongings would be liquidated to cover the demolition costs. He delivered this brutal eviction notice with a satisfied smirk, entirely convinced his display of dominance had broken my spirit. I ignored Jared completely. I turned my gaze directly to my daughter. Kendra stood near the fireplace, refusing to look at the family photographs lining the mantel. I asked her with a steady, quiet voice if she was absolutely certain about this transaction. I reminded her that she was actively facilitating the transfer of her childhood home, the very house where her mother and I raised her, to a commercial limited liability company owned by a man drowning in debt. I gave her one final opportunity to recognize the profound devastation she was bringing upon her own family. Kendra finally looked at me. Her expression held no guilt, no hesitation, and absolutely no remorse. She rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. She told me I was being dramatic and deliberately difficult. She accused me of standing in the way of her husband's legitimate business ventures simply because I hated seeing them succeed. She crossed her arms tightly and commanded me to stop being a stubborn burden to her future. She declared that Jared knew how to manage high-value assets and I simply needed to step aside. Her betrayal was absolute. The little girl I had worked double shifts at the rail yard to send to a premier university had been entirely consumed by a hollow obsession with synthetic wealth. She chose a fraudulent lifestyle over her own father. My conscience was now completely clear. I owed her no further protection. I slumped my shoulders forward, physically manifesting the deep defeat they were so eager to witness. I let my head drop slightly, mimicking the exhausted posture of an old man who had finally run out of fight. I reached forward with my heavily bandaged right hand. The thick medical gauze brushed against the sharp edge of the table. I intentionally gripped the silver pen with my injured fingers, letting a visible grimace of pain cross my face as the pressure aggravated the severe burn Jared had inflicted upon me just 24 hours ago. Jared watched my physical struggle with cold, unblinking satisfaction. I pulled the legal documents closer and pressed the pen to the signature line. I signed my personal individual name precisely as printed on the fraudulent paper. I signed it clearly and definitively, officially executing the trap Harvey and I had constructed in the pre-dawn hours. I pushed the papers back across the glass. The man acting as the notary hastily gathered the stack, applied his official ink stamp to the pages, and handed the entire bundle directly to Jared. Jared snatched the documents as if they were made of solid gold. He let out a sharp, booming laugh that rattled the windows of my quiet living room. He folded the papers aggressively and shoved them into his tailored jacket pocket. He pointed a finger at my chest and announced I had exactly 30 days to pack up my garbage before his bulldozers arrived to level the property. He told me my reign over this house was officially terminated. Jared did not waste another second. He grabbed Kendra by the elbow, eager to rush downtown and present his freshly minted forgery to his desperate commercial lenders. The corrupt doctor and the fake notary followed them out in complete silence, their dirty work concluded. The heavy front door slammed shut, shaking the picture frames on the walls. I stood up from my armchair, perfectly steady, the facade of the broken old man instantly vanishing. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. I watched Jared's luxury SUV reverse out of my driveway, speeding off toward the financial district to satisfy his massive default notice. They believed they had just executed the perfect theft. They had no idea they were driving a sealed federal indictment straight into a heavily monitored banking institution. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my secure cell phone. I dialed Harvey's direct office line. He answered on the first ring, fully anticipating my report. I did not offer any prolonged explanations. I gave him a single precise command. The rat took the bait. Notify the bank's fraud department. Lock the doors behind him. I sat in my quiet living room holding my secure cell phone to my ear. Harvey was on the other end of the line, sitting in his downtown office with direct access to the bank's fraud department. We listened as the final phase of Jared's destruction was set into motion. I could perfectly picture my son-in-law strutting through the revolving glass doors of the towering commercial bank. He was a man who operated entirely on borrowed confidence, leveraging stolen money to project an illusion of immense wealth. He walked straight past the regular tellers, ignoring the everyday working people, and marched directly into the executive suite of the commercial lending division. He demanded to see the senior loan officer managing his massive $2 million deficit. Jared dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany desk with a heavy thud. He unbuttoned his tailored jacket with the exaggerated swagger of a conquering king returning from battle. He slapped the freshly signed and notarized property deed down on the thick glass surface. He demanded the immediate clearance of his default status. He arrogantly instructed the loan officer to initiate the liquidation of my residential property by the end of the business day. He believed he had executed the ultimate theft flawlessly. He believed the forced signature of a battered, 70-year-old black man was his golden ticket out of total financial ruin. He sat back in the plush leather guest chair, crossed his legs, and waited for the bank to formally recognize his undeniable victory. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked voluntarily into a steel federal snare that I had built specifically for him. Harvey relayed the exact sequence of events unfolding in the bank's secure legal department. The senior loan officer took the deed transfer and immediately scanned the physical document into the bank's central verification system. Standard commercial lending procedure dictated a rigorous mandatory title search before any high-value collateral could be officially processed and cleared. The bank's legal team ran my residential address through the state commercial property database. The system did not generate a match for Jared's fraudulent submission. Instead, the computer screens flashed a massive, undeniable legal discrepancy in bright red text. The loan officer reviewed the irrefutable data, gathered the printed reports, and walked back into the executive suite. He did not offer Jared a congratulatory handshake or a warm smile. He placed the deed back on the desk and looked at my son-in-law with profound icy suspicion. The executive informed Jared that the individual who signed the document did not hold the title to the property. He stated clearly that a man named Hollis had absolutely no legal authority to transfer the deed because Hollis, the individual, did not own the estate. He revealed that a blind corporate trust named Vanguard Holdings had been the sole legal proprietor of the property for over a decade. Jared's confident, arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained completely from his face as the crushing reality of his own sheer incompetence finally caught up with him. He had been so blinded by his inherent classism and assumptions that he had not even run a basic title search. He had blindly assumed my modest lifestyle and worn clothes equated to complete financial ignorance. The bank executive delivered the fatal, undeniable blow. He informed Jared that submitting a forged collateral agreement across state lines to a federally insured financial institution was not a simple clerical error that could be brushed aside. It was a severe, premeditated federal crime. Jared had just handed a major commercial bank absolute, irrefutable written proof of aggravated wire fraud. The trap Harvey and I built had snapped shut with bone-breaking force. Federal banking protocols do not operate on sympathy, and they do not pause for hesitation. They trigger instantly and ruthlessly to protect institutional assets from active criminal threats. The senior loan officer picked up his desk phone and initiated a direct priority lock on Jared's entire financial portfolio. The executive looked Jared dead in the eyes and informed him of his new inescapable reality. Effective immediately, every single business account tied to his real estate development firm was completely frozen under active suspicion of wire fraud. Every corporate credit line was instantly suspended. Every operational budget, payroll account, and vendor payment system was seized pending a mandatory federal audit. Jared leaped out of his leather chair. Pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed him. The arrogant, untouchable real estate developer was suddenly reduced to a terrified, sweating criminal caught in the act. He demanded immediate access to his money. He threatened to call his aggressive defense lawyers. He shouted that this was a massive misunderstanding, a ridiculous bureaucratic mistake that he could easily explain if given the chance. The bank executive remained perfectly stoic, entirely unmoved by the frantic display. He informed Jared that there was nothing left to explain and no negotiations to be had. The bank was legally obligated to report the fraudulent submission directly to the federal authorities within the hour. Jared was no longer viewed as a struggling client trying to manage a bad debt. He was now categorized as an active hostile threat to a federally insured institution. The walls of the executive suite closed in on him. He realized in a matter of agonizing seconds that he was entirely trapped. His hollow empire of debt and lies was officially dead. Jared stumbled blindly out of the executive suite and practically ran out of the bank lobby. He burst through the revolving glass doors onto the busy downtown sidewalk, his chest heaving with sheer panic and adrenaline. He knew the federal agents would be drafting an arrest warrant before the end of the business day. He needed liquid cash immediately to hire a ruthless criminal defense attorney and to secure an untraceable escape route. He pulled out his smartphone with violently trembling hands and rapidly accessed his personal banking application, finding his own private accounts locked, frozen, and completely inaccessible. He pivoted without a single ounce of hesitation, morality, or loyalty. He accessed the joint marital savings and emergency credit lines he shared with my daughter Kendra. He ruthlessly drained her entire financial safety net in less than 2 minutes. He transferred every available dollar, completely maxing out her high-limit credit cards, and routed the stolen funds directly into an untraceable offshore shell account. He viewed his wife not as a partner, but as a final disposable asset to be exploited. He left Kendra entirely penniless, setting the stage for her total ruin to save his own skin. I was sitting in my study nursing a glass of ice water when the front door of my house crashed open. Heavy footsteps echoed rapidly down the hallway. Kendra stormed into the room like a hurricane of pure panic. She carried her expensive designer handbag, but her meticulously crafted image was completely fractured. Her face was flushed with frantic anger, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. She did not ask about the thick white bandages wrapped tightly around my right hand. She did not ask if I was in pain. She marched directly up to my desk and threw her platinum credit cards onto the wood with a sharp clatter. She began screaming. She demanded to know what I had done to her life. She told me she was humiliated at a high-end boutique downtown when every single one of her cards declined at the register in front of her affluent friends. She aggressively accused me of deploying my ruthless corporate lawyer to illegally freeze Jared's legitimate business transactions out of pure bitter spite. She shouted that I was trying to ruin her marriage because I was jealous of her husband's immense success. She stood there defending the very man who had shoved me into a scorching grill just a day prior, entirely convinced that I was the villain orchestrating her misery. She demanded I pick up the phone, call Harvey, and order the bank to release her accounts immediately. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply reached across the desk with my good hand and slid 2 pieces of paper directly into her line of sight. The first document was the certified medical report from the urgent care clinic explicitly detailing the severe 3rd-degree thermal burn caused by an unprovoked physical assault. The second document was a crisp copy of the official federal fraud alert generated by the commercial bank less than an hour ago. I told her to sit down and read the truth. Kendra glared at me, refusing to touch the papers. I did not give her a choice. I brutally dismantled the hollow illusion she called a life. I explained that her husband was not a successful real estate developer. He was an insolvent, desperate fraud drowning in $2 million of commercial debt. I laid out the exact timeline, shattering her perception of his wealth. I told her Jared forged my personal signature on a collateral agreement 3 months ago to secure a bridge loan. His luxury cars and designer clothes were funded entirely by stolen leverage. I explained how he physically attacked me at the barbecue because he needed the actual deed signed today to avoid a federal audit on Monday morning. I watched her eyes dart between my calm face and the official bank seal on the fraud notice. I told her the bank system flagged the forgery immediately because Vanguard Holdings owned the property, not me. I made it absolutely clear that my lawyer did not freeze her accounts. Federal banking protocols froze Jared's entire portfolio the second he submitted a forged document across state lines. The entire foundation of her affluent lifestyle was built on aggressive lies and criminal desperation. She had traded her morals for a mirage, and the mirage was officially bankrupt. She was married to a cornered felon who had just walked blindly into a federal trap. Kendra shook her head frantically, stepping back from the desk, as if the documents were coated in poison. She adamantly refused to believe it. She insisted Jared had millions tied up in secure offshore developments, and that the commercial bank simply made a massive administrative error. I did not argue with her delusion. I instructed her to take out her smartphone and log directly into her personal banking application. I told her to look closely at her joint savings and emergency credit lines. Her hands trembled violently as she gripped the phone and typed in her passcode. I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face. Her eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror. The screen displayed absolute zeros across every single account. The high-limit credit lines were maxed out to the final cent. I delivered the crushing reality. Jared knew federal agents were drafting an arrest warrant right now. He needed liquid cash to hire a criminal defense attorney and secure an untraceable escape route. He did not call her to explain the situation. He did not protect her. He ruthlessly drained her entire financial safety net and transferred every available dollar to an offshore shell account. He left his own wife entirely penniless to save his own skin. The glittering illusion of her perfect affluent life shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. Kendra collapsed into the guest chair and broke down into violent, breathless sobs. The arrogant woman from the barbecue was completely gone, replaced by a terrified victim, realizing she was standing on a sinking ship. Through her tears, she revealed a darker, fatal secret. She confessed that 6 months ago, Jared relentlessly coerced her into signing as the primary personal guarantor for his company's heavy equipment loans. She admitted she had blindly signed the commercial paperwork to keep the peace in her marriage. The bank was coming for her next. She was now legally and personally liable for $800,000 of Jared's corporate debt. She looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. She demanded I liquidate some of my hidden assets to pay off the massive liability and save her from federal bankruptcy. I looked at the daughter who had watched me burn and called me a burden. I told her firmly and coldly that I would not pay a single dime for her husband's crimes. The relentless grinding of the heavy-duty paper shredder filled the executive suite. Jared stood in the center of his luxurious office, stripping off his tailored suit jacket and throwing it onto a leather chair. He was locked inside the top floor of a sleek glass building, desperately attempting to erase his digital and physical footprints. He had abandoned his wife without a second thought, leaving her to face the financial devastation alone. Now his only goal was self-preservation. He pulled thick leather-bound financial ledgers from his mahogany shelves, ripping the pages out in handfuls and feeding them into the screaming machine. Sweat stained the collar of his designer shirt. His massive computer screens flashed rapidly as he ran military-grade wiping software on his encrypted hard drives. He believed the federal agents would take days to secure a warrant for his commercial office. He assumed this glass tower was his impenetrable fortress, completely isolated from the consequences of his actions. He thought if he could just sanitize his corporate records, he could claim the forged collateral document was a rogue mistake made by an incompetent assistant. He poured himself a generous glass of expensive scotch. His hands shook so violently that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim and stained his expensive rug. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. Desperately convincing himself he was still a master of the universe, he was completely oblivious to the fleet of black town cars pulling up to the curb directly below his window. I stepped out of Harvey's armored town car onto the pristine concrete of the commercial plaza. 4 armed private security contractors immediately flanked us. They wore unmarked black suits and moved with strict military precision. I looked up at the towering glass structure housing my son-in-law's firm. Jared always mocked my rusted truck and my faded work boots. He constantly boasted at family gatherings about the exorbitant rent he paid to maintain a penthouse office in the most prestigious business district in the state. He possessed a profound arrogance, but he lacked basic curiosity. He never bothered to check the actual ownership records of the property management company. He wrote his massive checks to every single month. During the late 1980s, while other men wasted their paychecks on flashy cars, I quietly purchased acres of toxic, abandoned industrial lots on the edge of the city. I used my union connections to clean the soil, held the land, and waited for the city limits to expand. When the corporate developers finally came knocking, I did not sell a single inch. I leased the ground beneath their feet. Vanguard Holdings owned this entire premium plaza. I was not just a retired electrician living on a fixed pension. I was Jared's direct landlord. We walked through the automatic sliding doors and bypassed the busy main reception desk. The building manager recognized Harvey instantly. He handed over the master electronic keycard without asking a single question. We rode the private executive elevator up to the penthouse suite. The polished chrome doors slid open to reveal Jared's bustling corporate floor. Dozens of sales agents and administrative assistants typed away on sleek computers. They were completely unaware that their paychecks had already bounced, and their company was effectively dead. We bypassed the cubicles and marched straight toward the frosted glass doors of the executive suite. The heavy brass handle of the executive suite was locked from the inside. The faint, high-pitched whine of the paper shredder echoed through the frosted glass. Jared was destroying evidence trying to buy time he simply did not possess. I gave a sharp nod to the lead security contractor. The guard stepped forward and swiped the master keycard. The electronic lock flashed green and disengaged with a heavy final click. He pushed the heavy glass doors open, violently shattering Jared's illusion of safety. Jared spun around, dropping a thick stack of financial ledgers onto the floor. His eyes widened in absolute horror when he saw me standing in the center of his pristine office, flanked by armed guards and my ruthless corporate attorney. Harvey did not give him a single moment to speak or formulate a lie. He stepped forward and slammed a formal legal document onto the mahogany desk. Harvey announced in a booming voice that resonated out into the open bullpen that Jared was being served with an immediate zero-day eviction notice. He stated clearly that Vanguard Holdings was terminating the commercial lease effective this very second, due to the tenant conducting illegal federal wire fraud on the premises. Jared's mouth opened and closed, unable to form words. He looked from Harvey to me, the crushing realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. The old black man he shoved into a hot grill literally owned the roof over his head. I gave the signal. The security contractor stepped forward, grabbing Jared firmly by his arms. He screamed and thrashed, demanding to call his lawyers. The guards ignored his frantic protests, dragging him forcibly out of his office. His entire staff stood up from their desks. They watched in stunned, breathless silence as their arrogant boss was physically frog-marched toward the freight elevators, leaving his shredded lies and his destroyed empire behind him. The security guards dumped Jared onto the cold, grease-stained concrete of the back alley. He stumbled and fell to his knees. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with dirty water. Utter humiliation burned through his veins. He had no office, no company accounts, and no wife left to manipulate. The federal authorities were closing in, and he was entirely out of legitimate options. He walked 2 blocks to a cheap convenience store. He purchased a prepaid burner phone using the crumpled cash he had stuffed in his pocket. He stood in the shadows of the alleyway and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was a contact from his underground gambling circles, a ruthless enforcer who specialized in violent debt collection and intimidation. Jared's voice shook with manic desperation as the call connected. He ordered a direct violent hit on my residential home for that very night. He told the enforcer about a heavy steel safe hidden in my private study. He lied and claimed it was packed with untraceable vintage gold coins he had seen years ago. He promised the armed men the entire contents of the safe in exchange for permanently eliminating his father-in-law. He thought he was sending wolves to slaughter a helpless, isolated sheep. He did not realize he was sending them straight into a high-voltage cage. The digital clock on my desk glowed a harsh red marking exactly 2 in the morning. I sat perfectly still in the high, back-leather chair of my study, the room completely shrouded in the heavy darkness of the early morning hours. I had not slept a single minute. The house was entirely silent until the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass violently cut through the stillness. The heavy pane of the kitchen door gave way with a sickening crash. Heavy, tactical boots crunched deliberately over the broken shards scattered across the tile floor. I did not flinch. I did not reach for a firearm. I simply waited in the pitch-black room. 3 men moved stealthily through my kitchen. Their high-powered flashlights cut frantic, jagged arcs across the dark walls, illuminating the space in brief, chaotic bursts. They communicated in harsh, muffled whispers, their voices tight with the raw adrenaline of a coordinated home invasion. I could hear the heavy metallic clatter of the firearms they carried strapped against their chests. They swept quickly through the dining room and moved deliberately toward the central residential corridor. They were hunting specifically for the hidden safe Jared had so vividly described to them. My son-in-law had spun them, a desperate, entirely fabricated tale of an isolated, helpless old man hoarding untraceable vintage gold coins. He promised them a massive, life-changing payout in exchange for a violent intrusion. They truly believed they were stalking a weak victim. They believed the quiet, modest brick house on the corner was a soft, easy target. They walked directly past the kitchen island and stepped firmly onto the hardwood floor of the main hallway. They had absolutely no idea they had just crossed the threshold into a highly engineered electrified cage. I had fully anticipated a violent physical escalation. When a predatory animal is backed into a corner and stripped of all its financial resources, it inevitably resorts to sheer unadulterated brutality. I knew Jared would lash out the exact moment he was thrown onto the street, with absolutely nothing left to his name. He was a fundamental coward who always utilized other people's money and other people's muscle to execute his dirty work. He severely underestimated the man he targeted. Before I amassed a massive commercial real estate portfolio, I spent 35 years working as a master electrician. I personally wired high-security industrial complexes, commercial bank vaults, and federal transit hubs across the entire state. I did not leave my personal residence unprotected. When I renovated this brick house 20 years ago, I installed a customized military-grade security infrastructure entirely hidden behind the modest drywall. I watched the three armed intruders advance slowly down the hallway on my specialized infrared security monitor. When the final man crossed the designated threshold, I reached under the heavy lip of my desk. I flipped a concealed toggle switch. A silent, automated lockdown sequence initiated instantly. Heavy reinforced steel shutters slammed down over every single exterior window and door in the house simultaneously. The thick metal sheets locked into solid concrete tracks with a deafening, unified crash. The intruders froze in absolute terror. Their flashlights darted wildly around the newly enclosed space. Before they could even formulate a reaction, a series of hidden motorized deadbolts engaged within the hallway itself. The heavy oak doors at both ends of the corridor slammed shut and locked magnetically with 2,000 pounds of holding force. The three armed men were completely sealed inside a windowless reinforced choke point. The master breaker instantly cut all power to the trapped zone, plunging them into total suffocating darkness. An automated encrypted emergency signal dispatched directly to the local police precinct dispatcher, flagging a priority one home invasion in progress with suspects secured on site. I remained seated in my quiet study, completely isolated from their frantic muffled shouts and the violent banging of their fists against the reinforced oak doors. My fortress held perfectly. The panicked screams of the trapped intruders echoed faintly through the thick drywall. They aggressively slammed the heavy butts of their firearms against the solid wood, but the reinforced doors did not yield a single fraction of an inch. Their initial violent aggression dissolved entirely into raw, suffocating panic. Within 4 short minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the front lawn, cutting brightly through the narrow steel slats of my exterior shutters. I accessed the primary security control panel on my desk and remotely disengaged the front entrance lock to grant access for the arriving officers. Heavily armed police swarmed into the house, their tactical flashlights slicing through the darkness of the living room. I calmly released the magnetic seal on the hallway door. The officers aggressively commanded the 3 blinded intruders to drop their weapons and get flat on the ground. The thugs complied, immediately throwing their firearms onto the hardwood and dropping to their knees with their hands raised. They were utterly defeated, severely disoriented, and entirely terrified by the flawless, inescapable trap. Heavy metal handcuffs clicked sharply around their wrists as they were violently hauled to their feet and shoved against the wall. I stood up from my desk, walked smoothly into the kitchen, and poured myself a hot cup of chamomile tea from the insulated thermos I had prepared hours earlier. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, taking a slow, steady sip of the warm liquid, while the chaotic arrest unfolded in my hallway. The lead officer approached me, his eyes sweeping over the sophisticated security setup with profound, undeniable respect. I calmly provided my official statement to the detective in charge. I detailed the precise timeline of the breach and handed the officer a digital drive containing the high-definition infrared footage of the entire invasion from start to finish. The 3 men were hauled directly to the local precinct and thrown into separate windowless interrogation rooms. The brutal reality of facing decades in state prison for armed robbery and a priority one home invasion shattered their criminal loyalty instantly. The leader of the crew, a heavily tattooed enforcer looking at his 3rd consecutive strike, demanded a formal plea deal within the first 10 minutes of intensive questioning. He completely flipped it on his employer without a second thought. He explicitly confessed to the lead detective that a desperate white real estate developer named Jared hired them just hours ago. He detailed the exact location of the burner phone call and outlined the entirely fabricated story about the hidden safe, filled with untraceable vintage gold. He handed the police the exact motive and the direct, undeniable connection to my son-in-law. The detectives did not waste a single second verifying the claim. The police immediately escalated the case to the district attorney on duty. A judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence and signed an emergency felony arrest warrant for Jared before the sun even began to rise over the city. The net was officially closed. Jared had orchestrated his own final, inescapable destruction. I sat in my study, the faint smell of ozone from the triggered security system still lingering in the cold morning air. My secure cell phone buzzed on the polished mahogany desk, disrupting the absolute silence of the house. The caller ID displayed an untraceable routing number. I pressed the record button on my heavy-duty audio software before answering the line. Jared's voice crackled through the speaker. I was no longer the arrogant real estate mogul, wearing custom linen shirts and gripping crystal glasses on my backyard patio. He sounded manic, out of breath, and completely unhinged. I could hear the distinct hollow echo of a cheap roadside motel room in the background, accompanied by the distant wailing blare of a highway patrol siren. The polished facade had entirely evaporated, leaving nothing but a cornered animal backed against a concrete wall. He did not bother with pleasantries or apologies. He aggressively demanded to know if I thought I had actually won this war. He rambled frantically about how the police raid on his hired thugs was just a temporary setback in his grand design. His breathing was heavy, ragged, with a toxic mix of sheer terror and adrenaline. I listened to his frantic pacing through the receiver, picturing him marching across a filthy carpet. I was a man who had leveraged his entire existence on looking untouchable, and now he was hiding in a room reeking of stale cigarette smoke, clutching a disposable plastic burner phone. He had gone from commanding a penthouse suite in my commercial plaza to hiding from active felony arrest warrants in a matter of hours. The sheer desperation radiating through the phone was palpable, but I felt absolutely no pity for the man who had shoved me into a scorching grill and laughed at my burning flesh. Jared stopped his frantic pacing and lowered his voice into a vicious, desperate sneer. He told me he was not going down alone, refusing to take the fall for a collapsing empire. He claimed he had spent the last 24 hours utilizing his encrypted laptop to doctor a massive trail of digital communications and internal financial ledgers. He boasted that he had meticulously altered the metadata on the fraudulent commercial loans and the forged property deed. I had explicitly framed my daughter Kendra as the absolute mastermind behind the entire $2 million wire fraud conspiracy. He stated that the federal investigators were already building their case, and if he submitted these fabricated digital files anonymously, Kendra would face a mandatory 20-year federal prison sentence. He knew she had blindly signed as the primary personal guarantor for his heavy equipment loans during their marriage, making his doctored narrative incredibly easy for a ruthless prosecutor to believe. He issued his ultimatum with venomous, calculated precision. He demanded I immediately contact my corporate attorneys and drop all civil litigation regarding the residential property and the commercial eviction. He demanded I wire exactly $2 million in untraceable funds to an offshore shell account he had hastily set up in the Cayman Islands. He claimed this exorbitant amount was the exact price of my daughter's freedom. He stated that once the funds cleared the international banking protocols, he would secure his passage out of the country and permanently destroy the fabricated digital evidence against Kendra. He gave me exactly 24 hours to execute the massive transfer. He truly believed this hollow extortion attempt gave him the upper hand. I thought a father's unconditional love would override my logical judgment and force me to capitulate to a desperate fugitive. He assumed I would panic at the thought of my daughter sitting in a federal penitentiary. I let his heavy, ragged breathing fill the silence of the line for a long moment. My specialized audio software captured every single syllable of his federal extortion attempt in crystal clear, high definition. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for my daughter's safety, and I certainly did not offer to negotiate terms. I spoke with the cold, unyielding authority of a man who had dismantled far tougher and smarter enemies before breakfast. I told Jared his inherent classist arrogance had completely blinded him to his own profound incompetence. I explained that a man who could not even run a basic title search on a residential property lacked the intellectual capacity to fool the digital forensics team at the Federal Bureau of Investigation with hastily doctored metadata. I reminded him that I already possessed the physical evidence of his massive bank fraud, the sworn confessions of his hired thugs sitting in a police precinct, and now a flawless audio recording of him attempting to extort $2 million while actively threatening to frame a federal witness. I informed him that I do not negotiate with financial terrorists, and I absolutely do not fund the escapes of cornered cowards. I told him he had dug his own grave with his toxic greed, and I was perfectly content to stand on the edge and watch him fall into the dirt. I advised my son-in-law to burn in hell, and I firmly disconnected the call, cutting off his frantic shouting. I placed the phone back on my desk and watched the audio file finish saving securely to my encrypted cloud server. Despite my absolute refusal to engage with Jared's blackmail, I recognized the immediate fatal danger Kendra was currently in. Jared was entirely erratic, highly volatile, and possessed enough historical access to her personal accounts to cause severe legal complications if he dumped his fabricated files to the federal authorities. I could not simply wait for the local police to track the location of his burner phone. I needed to take the offensive, completely sever his final lifeline, and strip him of any remaining resources that could possibly fund his escape across international borders. I opened my secure corporate ledger and accessed the intelligence network I utilized for Vanguard Holdings. I located the primary angel investor funding Jared's hollow real estate empire. It was a ruthless, highly leveraged billionaire who operated entirely in the shadows of the city's elite financial circles and knew absolutely nothing about the underlying wire fraud Jared had committed. I decided it was time to introduce this billionaire to the massive toxic liability he was currently harboring in his portfolio. I would obliterate Jared's last remaining financial shield and leave him with absolutely nowhere to run. Harvey and I did not waste a single hour. By 10 o'clock the next morning, we walked into the towering glass headquarters of Sterling Capital. Richard Sterling was a billionaire angel investor who operated entirely in the shadows of the city's elite financial circles. He was the invisible spine supporting Jared's hollow real estate empire. Richard knew absolutely nothing about the underlying wire fraud or the violent home invasions Jared had orchestrated. He only cared about his quarterly returns. We bypassed the lobby and were escorted directly to a highly secure corporate boardroom on the 50th floor. The room was intimidating, paneled in dark walnut with a massive marble conference table stretching across the center. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by two of his own aggressive corporate attorneys. He looked at my faded boots and modest jacket with a flicker of distinct irritation. He clearly expected a desperate father begging for a financial handout to save a failing son-in-law. He assumed my presence in his boardroom was a waste of his extremely valuable time. He demanded to know why Harvey had invoked a priority emergency clause to secure this meeting. I did not sit down. I walked straight to the center of the marble table. I looked directly into the eyes of a man accustomed to crushing his opponents with a single phone call. I informed him that I was not there to ask for a favor. I was there to offer him a highly exclusive, time-sensitive opportunity to save his own reputation from a catastrophic federal disaster. I told him his primary developer was actively dragging his pristine firm into an inescapable criminal vortex. Richard leaned forward, his arrogant smirk hardening into a sharp glare. He commanded me to explain my bold accusation before he had his security throw us out of the building. I opened my leather briefcase and methodically laid out the instruments of Jared's absolute destruction across the polished marble. I did not raise my voice or employ theatrical emotion. I let the brutal facts dictate the narrative. I started with the certified bank fraud notices. I slid the federal documents across the table, detailing exactly how Jared had forged my signature to pledge a property he did not own. Richard picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud committed by his golden boy. Next, Harvey placed the zero-day commercial eviction records beside the bank notices. He explained that Vanguard Holdings, the company I personally built from abandoned industrial lots, had evicted Jared for conducting illegal federal crimes on my commercial premises. Richard's attorneys leaned in their faces paling as they recognized the severe legal implications. I did not stop there. I placed a digital audio player on the table and hit play. Jared's manic, desperate voice echoed through the pristine boardroom. The room listened in absolute silence as my son-in-law attempted to extort $2 million from me, explicitly threatening to frame his own wife with doctored digital evidence if I refused to fund his escape to the Cayman Islands. To deliver the final crushing blow, I produced the official felony arrest warrant issued by the local police precinct just hours prior. I explained that Jared had hired 3 armed men from an underground gambling syndicate to breach my home at midnight. The thugs were currently sitting in holding cells, actively testifying against Jared in exchange for plea deals. I looked at the billionaire investor. I told him Jared was not a visionary real estate developer, building a lucrative portfolio. Jared was a cornered, highly volatile fugitive, actively fleeing multiple felony charges and federal indictments. The millions of dollars Richard had poured into Jared's shell companies were completely gone, evaporated by massive gambling debts and a desperate attempt to maintain a fake, affluent lifestyle. I warned Richard that Jared's toxic incompetence had officially infected his own capital. Jared was a sinking ship strapped to a massive anchor, and he was fully prepared to drag his wealthiest investor down to the bottom of the ocean to save himself. The undeniable physical evidence sitting on the table demanded an immediate, ruthless response. Harvey took control of the conversation with lethal corporate precision. He addressed Richard directly, utilizing the cold language of financial survival. Harvey warned the billionaire that any further association with Jared would trigger a massive, unavoidable audit by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The moment the federal authorities traced the fraudulent wire transfers back to Sterling Capital, Richard's entire portfolio would be frozen, scrutinized, and subjected to devastating public exposure. Harvey made it absolutely clear that funding a fugitive attempting to flee international borders would be classified as aiding and abetting a federal criminal. Richard was a ruthless man who protected his money above all else. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for a moment to consider the situation or consult his legal team further. He picked up his desk phone and contacted his chief financial officer. He issued an immediate, irrevocable directive to sever all ties with Jared's real estate development firm. He ordered the complete freezing of the last $3 million of Jared's operational budget. He legally blocked every avenue of capital flow, ensuring Jared could not access a single cent of the remaining investor funds. Richard hung up the phone and looked at me with a nod of grim professional respect. Jared's financial empire was officially decapitated. He had absolutely no money, no leverage, and no means to fund his escape from the country. His total destruction was cemented in that boardroom. The sprawling real estate facade he used to belittle me and manipulate my daughter was reduced to ashes. We walked out of the towering glass building and stepped into the bright morning sun. I had successfully severed Jared's final lifeline. He was now a ghost with empty pockets. A cornered rat bites hardest when it realizes the trap is completely inescapable. Stripped of his money, his office, and his hired muscle, Jared resorted to the only weapon he had left. He launched a desperate psychological attack. By noon, my cell phone began buzzing incessantly, with notifications from local community news blogs and social media platforms. Jared had uploaded a highly fabricated tearful video recorded from his filthy motel room. He looked directly into the camera, weaponizing his white tears and fake affluent charm. He claimed to his thousands of followers that I was suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia. He told the public that a corrupt predatory lawyer was actively manipulating my fragile mental state to steal his legitimate business and ruin my own daughter's life. He begged the community for help, painting himself as the innocent victim of a horrific elder abuse scam. He sought to destroy my reputation and turn my own neighborhood against me. The video spread like wildfire, igniting a dangerous public backlash. He was trying to wield public outrage as a shield against his impending federal arrest. He had just turned a private war into a highly visible public spectacle. He had no idea how brutally I would respond. My phone started vibrating endlessly on the surface of my mahogany desk. The notification chimes bled together into a continuous irritating drone. The video Jared uploaded spread like a highly contagious virus through our local community network. He played the innocent, desperate victim, perfectly weaponizing his fake tears and polished charm to manipulate the masses. He spun a deeply malicious narrative of a helpless, dementia-ridden old black man being maliciously controlled by a greedy corporate lawyer. He claimed this phantom lawyer was exploiting my failing mind to steal his legitimate business and destroy his loving family. The community swallowed the lie without chewing. His loving family. The community swallowed the lie without chewing. People I had known for decades, men and women I had broken bread with at my own church congregation, turned on me with terrifying speed. The voicemails piled up by the dozens. I listened to former neighbors calling me a bitter, senile old fool who was destroying his own daughter's marriage out of pure spite. They demanded I drop the aggressive civil lawsuits immediately. They treated me with open hostility, leaving venomous, threatening messages on my secure line and whispering about my mental decline in the aisles of the local grocery store. They fully believed Jared's emotional manipulation because society is heavily conditioned to view the elderly as fragile, confused, and easily manipulated by legal sharks. They wanted a dramatic neighborhood tragedy, and Jared expertly served them a soapy manufactured opera. The sheer velocity of the social backlash was staggering. He was actively trying to wield public outrage as a massive, impenetrable shield to delay his impending federal arrest. He truly believed the collective weight of neighborhood judgment would break my spirit, force me into submission, and compel me to release his frozen funds. He assumed I cared about the opinions of hypocrites. I did not issue a defensive public statement to the press. I did not record a pathetic pleading response video trying to justify my legal actions or prove my sanity to a crowd of strangers who had already convicted me in the court of public opinion. I do not argue with fools, and I absolutely do not beg for validation from hypocrites who turn their backs at the first sign of manufactured drama. I sat in the absolute silence of my study and called Harvey on his direct line. I instructed him to utilize Vanguard Holdings' extensive operational budget to immediately purchase premium, unskippable advertisement space on the exact same local community news blogs and social media platforms Jared had used to launch his smear campaign. We targeted the precise demographic of angry neighbors and church members who were currently filling my voicemail inbox with venom and judgment. I did not hire a public relations firm to draft a polished, politically correct press release. I chose a brutally simple and devastatingly effective strategy. I instructed Harvey to release 2 raw, completely unedited digital files directly to the public domain. We uploaded the highly sensitive files with absolutely no commentary, no explanatory voiceover, and no dramatic musical score to sway the audience. We simply let the naked, undeniable truth speak for itself. The internet is a ruthless amplifier, and I was about to feed it the ultimate unfiltered reality check. We bypassed the slow, methodical churn of the legal system and struck Jared directly in the center of his carefully fabricated social arena. The massive ad spaces went live by 3 o'clock that afternoon, aggressively hijacking the top banner of every community forum and social media feed in the district. Anyone trying to view Jared's tearful plea was immediately and forcibly confronted with the unvarnished reality of his violent actions. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee and watched the digital analytics on my computer screen skyrocket into the thousands. I was not playing a petty game of public relations. I was executing a digital execution. I was using his chosen battlefield to annihilate his last remaining shred of credibility and expose him as the violent predator he truly was. The first file to hit the local servers was the 4K backyard security footage from the day of the barbecue. It played in stark high-definition clarity, capturing every brutal detail of the assault. The entire neighborhood watched in undeniable horror as Jared aggressively cornered a 70-year-old man against the brick patio. They saw his polite, affluent facade drop completely. They saw the violent, deliberate shove against my chest. They watched my right hand slam directly onto the scorching cast-iron edge of the grill. The high-quality audio captured the sickening hiss of burning flesh, followed immediately by Jared's loud, mocking laughter, as he arrogantly announced to the crowd that I had just tripped over my own feet. The second file auto-played immediately after the violent video concluded. It was the crystal-clear audio recording of Jared attempting to blackmail me from his filthy roadside motel room. The community listened in stunned silence to the frantic, manic voice of the man who had just played the innocent weeping victim hours prior. They heard him explicitly threaten to frame my daughter for federal wire fraud. They heard him demand a $2 million offshore wire transfer to fund his illegal escape to the Cayman Islands. They heard the raw, vicious venom of a cornered criminal boasting about doctoring digital evidence to send his own wife to a federal penitentiary. The stark contrast between his tearful public video and the vicious predatory reality of these raw files was absolute and devastating. The false narrative he spun shattered instantly under the crushing weight of objective truth. Public opinion flipped with violent, explosive speed. The exact same neighbors who had condemned me began leaving frantic, tearful apologies on my voicemail. The community turned their collective righteous rage directly onto Jared. Across town, Kendra sat alone in her dark, quiet apartment, staring blankly at her phone screen. She watched the unedited security footage of her husband violently shoving me into the grill and laughing as my skin burned. The persistent illusion she clung to completely died. She finally saw the absolute monster she had married. She stood up feeling physically sick to her stomach and walked to the hallway closet to grab her winter coat. Reaching blindly onto the top shelf, her hand knocked over a heavy hidden canvas duffel bag. It hit the floor hard, spilling its contents across the hardwood. Kendra stared at the scattered items in sheer paralyzing terror. Lying on the floor were thick, banded stacks of $100 bills, a second passport, bearing a completely fake name and a printed one-way flight itinerary to Belize departing at midnight. Jared was never planning to fight the federal fraud charges alongside her. He was leaving her to face the FBI completely alone. The doorbell did not ring. I simply heard the slow, defeated turning of the spare key in the front lock. Kendra walked into my living room, but the woman crossing the threshold was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant socialite who had stood on my patio just days ago. The expensive designer trench coat was gone, replaced by a plain, wrinkled gray sweater. The heavy, flawless makeup she used as a shield had been completely washed away by hours of crying, leaving her face pale and hollow. She carried no oversized, luxury handbag. She carried absolutely no arrogance. She looked like a ghost wandering aimlessly through the wreckage of her own life. I remained seated behind my mahogany desk, watching her approach with cold, calculated observation. She did not speak right away. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the items she had brought with her. She stopped at the edge of my desk and dropped a heavy, dark canvas duffel bag onto the polished wood. The zipper was pulled wide open. She reached inside and pulled out thick, banded stacks of $100 bills, tossing them onto the desk. Then she dropped the final devastating pieces of evidence directly in front of me. A crisp, newly minted second passport bearing Jared's photograph, alongside a completely fabricated name and a printed one-way first-class flight itinerary to Belize departing at midnight. She stared at the items, her chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. The undeniable proof of her husband's ultimate betrayal lay scattered between us. He had packed his bags to run from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, leaving his wife holding the bag for $800,000 in fraudulent commercial debt. The silence in the study was absolute and suffocating. Kendra stared at the fake passport, the reality of her shattered existence, finally crushing the last remaining pillars of her denial. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, grabbing the edge of my desk, as violent, breathless sobs ripped through her chest. She wept with the raw, guttural agony of someone who had just watched their entire universe burn to ash. She begged for my forgiveness, the words pouring out of her in a frantic, desperate stream. She admitted with brutal honesty that I had been absolutely right about Jared from the very beginning. She acknowledged her own profound toxic greed. She confessed that she had been utterly seduced by the illusion of unlimited wealth and the intoxicating validation of affluent society. She told me she had chosen the flashy cars and the country club memberships over the strict, honorable morals I had spent my entire life teaching her. She wept for the father she had betrayed and the marriage that was entirely built on a foundation of criminal lies. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red, and pleaded for salvation. She knew the federal authorities were meticulously building a massive wire fraud case. She knew her signature was legally binding on the fraudulent heavy equipment loans Jared had secured. She was terrified of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary, taking the fall for a man who was actively trying to flee the country and frame her for his crimes. She begged me to deploy Harvey and the vast resources of Vanguard Holdings to shield her from the impending federal indictments. She asked me to save her life. I looked down at my daughter kneeling on the floor. I remembered the little girl I had worked grueling double shifts at the rail yard to support. But I also vividly remembered the grown woman who had watched her husband shove me into a scorching grill and called me a selfish burden. Pity is a useless emotion in a crisis. Survival requires absolute clarity. I did not offer her a warm, comforting embrace. I did not tell her everything would magically be all right. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, leaning forward slightly to look her directly in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly low, cold, and entirely devoid of paternal softness. I told her that tears do not erase federal indictments. I explained that crying on my floor would not stop the Federal Bureau of Investigation from kicking down her apartment door by tomorrow morning. I stated clearly that forgiveness is not a gift that can be handed out simply because she finally realized she was married to a monster. Forgiveness in this house requires definitive, ruthless action. I laid out the exact terms of her salvation. I told her that if she wanted my protection, if she wanted Harvey to deploy his legal arsenal to sever her liability from Jared's massive corporate debt, she had to earn it. She could not just walk away and play the innocent victim. She had to actively participate in the total, inescapable destruction of the man who had tried to destroy us both. I told her she must serve as the primary bait in the final trap. We were not going to let Jared board a plane to Belize. We were going to ensure he walked blindly into a federal cage and never breathed free air again. I demanded her absolute loyalty to my plan, warning her that any hesitation or lingering sympathy for her husband would result in my immediate withdrawal of all legal support. She would face the federal prosecutors completely alone. I asked her if she was ready to deliver her husband to the authorities. Kendra did not hesitate for a single second. The betrayal had burned away any remaining affection she held for Jared. She nodded firmly, wiping the tears from her face, her expression hardening into a cold mirror of my own resolve. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and unlocked the screen. Under my direct supervision, she drafted a highly calculated text message to Jared's burner phone. She spun a brilliant, desperate lie. She typed that she had discovered his escape bag, but instead of calling the police, she had leveraged her access to my home to steal the physical encrypted login tokens for my offshore corporate trust accounts. She claimed the tokens held access to over $5 million in untraceable liquid cash. She told him to meet her at the high-security private bank vault downtown in exactly 2 hours so they could initiate the transfer together before fleeing the country. She hit send. The delivery confirmation pinged instantly. Jared was a desperate, greedy rat running out of time. The promise of $5 million untraceable dollars was bait he fundamentally could not resist. The final stage was officially set. The trap required a battlefield where a cornered rat could not physically escape. I selected a high-security private vault depository situated in the center of the financial district. Harvey utilized his extensive corporate leverage to requisition the entire sub-level facility for the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the building was completely sanitized of civilian clients and standard banking personnel. We replaced them with a highly specialized unit of local detectives and armed federal agents. They moved with absolute silent precision. The operation was engineered to be completely inescapable. The primary vault room was a subterranean steel box equipped with reinforced titanium walls and a solitary electronic entrance. Armed tactical officers established strategic perimeters in the adjacent observation rooms and the surveillance control center. I stood beside the lead federal investigator in the monitoring bay, watching the live high-definition feed from multiple concealed cameras. Harvey stood to my left, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the digital monitors with predatory anticipation. We had wired the primary vault with military-grade audio receivers. Every breath, every footstep, and every single word spoken inside that steel cage would be captured, recorded, and instantly transmitted to the prosecutors waiting on standby. The sheer scale of the law enforcement presence reflected the massive severity of Jared's wire fraud and extortion attempts. He had successfully manipulated his way through affluent society using charm and stolen money. He was about to walk blindly into a strictly regulated environment where his fraudulent charisma held absolutely zero value. The stage was flawlessly set. The federal snare was pulled taut. We simply waited in the oppressive silence of the control room for the arrogant target to cross the threshold and seal his own fate. Kendra sat alone inside the center of the massive steel vault. A heavy stainless steel table sat in front of her, holding a single disconnected computer terminal. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, fighting a violent internal war against her own rising panic. The sterile fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her exhausted face. She was a woman actively preparing to deliver her husband to a federal penitentiary. The heavy silence of the underground room was broken by the sharp metallic hiss of the hydraulic entrance mechanism. The massive vault door swung open. Jared stepped inside. He had completely abandoned his tailored linen suits and polished aesthetic. He wore a faded black hooded sweatshirt, a pulled-down baseball cap, and oversized dark sunglasses, presenting a pathetic, highly suspicious caricature of a man attempting to remain invisible. He quickly scanned the sterile room, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. He slammed the heavy vault door shut behind him, manually engaging the thick interior deadbolts to isolate them from the outside world. He believed he was securing his ultimate escape. He ripped the sunglasses off his face, revealing bloodshot, manic eyes. He did not ask Kendra how she was holding up. He did not apologize for draining her accounts and leaving her penniless. He marched directly across the room and violently grabbed her upper arm. His fingers dug deeply into her flesh. He aggressively demanded the physical login tokens to my offshore trust accounts. He hissed that his private jet charter was departing from a regional airfield in less than 3 hours, and he needed the $5 million wired to the Cayman Islands immediately. Kendra winced in physical pain, but she did not pull away. The sharp sting of his grip served as the final necessary catalyst. It eradicated any lingering shred of misplaced loyalty she held for the man. She looked directly into his manic eyes. She demanded to know why he abandoned her with an $800,000 debt while he packed a bag to flee the country. She challenged him to look his wife in the face and explain his absolute betrayal. Kendra wore a microscopic high-fidelity transmitter securely taped beneath the collar of her sweater. Every syllable of her confrontation was broadcasting directly to the federal agents waiting just beyond the steel walls. She demanded the truth. Jared scoffed a vile, venomous sound that echoed harshly off the titanium walls. His arrogance completely overrode his basic survival instincts. He leaned in close to her face and delivered a brutally honest confession. I explicitly admitted he never held a single ounce of genuine love for her. He stated with vicious clarity that he only married her to gain proximity to the massive corporate wealth her father meticulously concealed. He detailed how he despised pretending to respect a stubborn, blue-collar old black man who refused to hand over his assets to a superior real estate developer. Jared then unleashed a barrage of cruel mockery. He laughed directly in her face, ridiculing her for being incredibly naive and profoundly stupid. He boasted about how easily he had manipulated her into signing the primary guarantor documents for his heavy equipment loans. He proudly confessed that she was nothing but a convenient disposable shield designed to absorb the total financial impact of his inevitable corporate bankruptcy. He admitted he fully intended to let her rot in a federal prison while he lived comfortably on a tropical beach using her father's money. His confession was absolute, detailed, and unprompted. It provided the federal prosecutors with an ironclad, undeniable admission of premeditated financial fraud, marital exploitation, and grand extortion. He had just verbally signed his own extensive prison sentence. Jared abruptly shoved Kendra backward into her chair, entirely dismissing her existence. He demanded she hand over the digital tokens instantly. He turned his back to her and stepped eagerly toward the computer terminal, his fingers twitching with the anticipation of stealing $5 million. He never reached the keyboard. A heavy, deafening metallic clank reverberated through the steel room. The master electronic lock on the vault door engaged automatically from the outside control room. The hydraulic seals pressurized with a sharp hiss, permanently locking the heavy door into the solid concrete frame. Jared froze, staring at the thick steel barrier as the terrifying realization of his confinement washed over him. He spun around, sheer panic replacing his arrogant sneer. He realized he was locked inside a subterranean cage. The deep shadows in the rear corner of the vault shifted. I stepped forward into the harsh fluorescent light, emerging from behind a towering rack of safety deposit boxes. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had burned my hand and attempted to destroy my bloodline. Jared spun away from the disconnected computer terminal. The deafening echo of the hydraulic vault door sealing shut still reverberated violently against the titanium walls. He stared at the thick steel barrier, his breathing abruptly halting. He turned his manic bloodshot eyes back to the center of the room. He expected to see his terrified wife cowering in her chair, ready to hand over his salvation. Instead, he saw me. I stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent light, leaving the deep shadows of the deposit racks behind me. I did not hold a digital login token. I held absolutely nothing. Jared looked at my empty hands, then back to the sealed door. The terrifying arithmetic of his situation finally computed in his desperate mind. There was no offshore trust account waiting to be drained. There was no $5 million wire transfer to fund a private jet to Belize. The entire scenario was a meticulously engineered fabrication, designed solely to lure him into a federal cage. His guaranteed escape route was permanently sealed behind 2,000 pounds of pressurized steel. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The slick, arrogant real estate developer completely vanished. The polished facade he used to scam commercial banks and manipulate my daughter dissolved into thin air. He was entirely stripped of his leverage. Pure, unadulterated panic flooded his expression, rapidly boiling over into absolute feral rage. He realized he had willingly walked into a subterranean trap. He was locked inside a windowless box with the exact man he had severely underestimated. He glared at me, his chest heaving aggressively, his fists clenching at his sides as the inescapable reality of a mandatory federal prison sentence crashed down upon him. He knew the authorities were listening. He knew his confession had just sealed his fate. A cornered animal possesses no logic, only a violent instinct for survival. Jared completely snapped. The remaining shreds of his sanity evaporated in the sterile air of the vault. He let out a visceral, guttural scream that bounced aggressively off the metal walls. He lunged toward the heavy stainless steel table sitting in the center of the room. His hand closed around a solid brass paperweight resting near the useless computer terminal. He gripped the heavy metal object with white-knuckled desperation. He locked his manic eyes directly on my face. He did not intend to simply injure me. He intended to cave my skull in believing he could somehow extract the non-existent access codes, or force the vault open if he eliminated the only obstacle standing in his way. He charged at me with terrifying, reckless speed. He raised the brass weight high above his head, aiming a lethal strike directly at my temple. He profoundly miscalculated his target yet again. He saw a fragile 70-year-old man with a heavily bandaged right hand. He forgot. I survived 35 years working grueling double shifts on industrial construction sites. Decades of hauling heavy copper wiring and dodging massive swinging machinery had permanently embedded a sharp physical intuition into my muscle memory. I did not panic. I did not flinch or raise my arms in weak defense. I waited until the absolute last fraction of a second. I planted my left foot firmly against the concrete floor and pivoted my entire body sharply to the side. I sidestepped his violent assault with practiced, effortless agility. Jared carried too much aggressive momentum. He swung the heavy brass weight through empty air. He could not stop his forward trajectory. He tripped over his own clumsy feet and flew past me. He crashed violently headfirst into the towering wall of solid steel safety deposit boxes. The sickening crunch of bone meeting metal echoed sharply through the vault. He dropped the brass paperweight. It clattered loudly onto the floor. Jared collapsed onto the cold concrete, clutching his bleeding face, entirely immobilized by the brutal impact of his own reckless momentum. I stepped forward and looked down at the pathetic man writhing on the vault floor. Blood leaked from his broken nose, staining his faded, hooded sweatshirt. I stood over him, projecting absolute authority. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, piercing precision of a judge delivering a final sentence. I told him his failure was entirely self-inflicted. I explained that his deep-rooted classist arrogance had been his ultimate downfall from the very beginning. He looked at a black man in a rusted truck and faded work boots, and he automatically assumed I was intellectually inferior. He believed his tailored suits and leveraged debt made him inherently smarter. I told him his superiority complex fundamentally blinded him to every single trap I set. He never bothered to run a basic title search on my property because he assumed I was too uneducated to utilize a corporate blind trust. He never considered that the quiet retired electrician he shoved into a hot grill possessed the strategic capacity to systematically dismantle his entire fake empire in less than a week. I looked at his bleeding face and informed him that real power does not need to shout or wear expensive colognes. Real power operates in the shadows, builds solid foundations, and strikes only when the enemy has confidently dug their own grave. I told him he was nothing but a cheap, fraudulent coward who had just been utterly destroyed by the exact man he considered disposable. He thought he could steal my home and cast me aside without facing a single consequence. I made sure he understood that his arrogance had cost him his company, his wealth, his marriage, and his freedom. Jared groaned, attempting to push himself up off the concrete floor to offer a weak rebuttal. He never got the chance. A loud, sharp electronic buzzer pierced the air. The hydraulic seals on the massive vault door hissed loudly, depressurizing in an instant. The heavy titanium barrier swung wide open. The blinding glare of tactical flashlights immediately flooded the subterranean room, cutting through the shadows. A specialized team of armed federal agents and local detectives swarmed into the vault with flawless military execution. Their weapons were drawn and aimed squarely at the bleeding man on the floor. The lead federal investigator shouted a deafening command ordering Jared to stay completely flat on the ground and put his hands behind his back. The trap was officially closed. The hunt was entirely over. The lead federal agent did not issue a second warning. He closed the distance between them in two massive strides and drove his shoulder directly into Jared's chest. The impact lifted my son-in-law off his feet and slammed him violently against the cold concrete floor of the vault. The heavy thud of bone hitting stone echoed through the steel room. Two local detectives immediately pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists signaled the absolute end of his freedom. Jared thrashed wildly against the officers, his designer shoes scrambling for traction on the slick floor, but the federal agents easily overpowered him. A detective planted his knee firmly between Jared's shoulder blades, pinning him completely flat. The lead agent leaned down and recited his Miranda rights with cold, practiced precision, his voice slicing through Jared's frantic, breathless curses. Another officer systematically searched the pockets of Jared's faded, hooded sweatshirt. He pulled out the crisp, newly minted fake passport Kendra had delivered, tossing it onto the stainless steel table. He followed it with a thick stack of banded $100 bills and the printed one-way flight itinerary to Belize. The physical evidence of his premeditated flight from federal prosecution lay entirely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jared stared sideways at the fake passport from his position on the floor. His chest heaved with violent, panicked breaths as the inescapable reality of his situation tightened around his throat. He was caught dead to rights inside a sealed subterranean cage with the exact forged documents required to ensure a maximum federal prison sentence. The physical takedown was flawless and brutally efficient. Yet even with his face pressed hard against the concrete and cold steel binding his wrists, Jared fundamentally refused to accept his defeat. The toxic, deep-rooted arrogance that defined his entire existence completely overrode his basic survival instincts. He twisted his neck, looked up at me, standing quietly in the corner, and let out a vicious, guttural laugh. He coughed roughly and spat a thick wad of blood onto the pristine floor of the vault, staining the concrete just inches from my boots. He smiled a manic, broken smile, his teeth stained red. He loudly proclaimed that this entire coordinated federal ambush was nothing but a minor temporary inconvenience. He boasted that I was an absolute fool if I believed local police and a few federal badges could actually hold him in a cage. He screamed that his father possessed immense political connections and unfathomable wealth. He confidently declared that his family's high-priced legal team would have him bailed out of federal custody and sitting comfortably in a luxury hotel suite before midnight. He thrashed against the detective's knee, his voice rising into a feral, unhinged roar. He swore that the moment he stepped out of his holding cell, he would dedicate every single resource at his disposal to permanently destroying my life and obliterating Kendra. He threatened to drag my name through a relentless, agonizing public smear campaign and ensure my daughter took the absolute maximum fall for his corporate fraud. He promised to bankrupt us, ruin our reputations, and make us deeply regret the day we dared to challenge a superior intellect. He believed his generational wealth made him inherently untouchable. He believed his father's vast real estate empire provided an impenetrable shield against any legal consequence. He lay bleeding on the floor of a locked bank vault, surrounded by armed federal agents, and still genuinely thought he possessed the ultimate upper hand. His delusion was absolute, blinding him completely to the precise, devastating countermeasure I had already set in motion. He sneered that my blue-collar background meant I fundamentally lacked the endurance for a protracted legal war against a true billionaire dynasty. He called me a pathetic old laborer who got incredibly lucky playing the market, insisting that real power always crushes fresh money. He vowed to rip Vanguard Holdings apart piece by piece until I was forced back into a dilapidated house begging for scraps. He wanted me to feel the same suffocating terror he felt when the vault door sealed shut. I simply stared down at him, entirely unmoved by his frantic, bleeding threats. His empty promises of vengeance were nothing but the dying rattles of a venomous snake completely severed from its head. The heavy hydraulic door of the vault hissed open a second time. My corporate litigator Harvey stepped into the secure room with absolute predatory confidence. He did not look at the armed officers or the blood on the floor. He walked directly over to Jared and crouched down slightly, holding a single, freshly printed financial document in his right hand. Harvey looked at the manic, bleeding man and delivered the final, fatal execution of his empire. He informed Jared with cold, corporate precision that his father's massive real estate firm no longer existed. Harvey held the document up to Jared's face. It was an official declaration of a hostile corporate takeover. He explained that 24 hours ago, Vanguard Holdings aggressively leveraged Jared's massive defaulted debts to trigger a catastrophic margin call against his father's primary holding company. The firm was completely bankrupted and legally acquired by my corporation for pennies on the dollar. Harvey did not stop there. He delivered the ultimate devastating reality check. He stated clearly that Jared's father was not calling in political favors or hiring elite defense attorneys to secure a midnight bail. To avoid his own devastating federal indictment for enabling his son's wire fraud, Jared's father had actively signed a comprehensive immunity deal. He was currently sitting in a federal building, fully cooperating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, handing over every single encrypted hard drive and hidden ledger required to put his own son away for decades. Harvey stood up, straightened his suit jacket, and looked down at the shattered man. He told Jared that his generational shield was completely obliterated. No one was coming to rescue him. The brutal, inescapable reality of his total destruction finally fractured Jared's mind completely. The manic, arrogant laughter abruptly died in his throat. The illusion of his untouchable superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He realized he was entirely abandoned by his investors, betrayed by his own father, and permanently outmaneuvered by the exact man he had violently assaulted. He collapsed emotionally right there on the cold concrete. He stopped fighting the handcuffs and let out a high, pathetic sob that echoed miserably against the titanium walls. The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet. He did not issue any more threats. He wept openly, his body completely limp as the detectives dragged his broken form out of the vault and down the sterile hallway. I stood in the empty steel room listening to the heavy thud of his shoes fading into the distance. The trap had worked flawlessly. The predator was permanently caged. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the final public reckoning was still required to legally cement his doom. 6 months later, the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal the absolute conclusion of his criminal existence. 6 months passed. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal the absolute conclusion of a hollow empire. The courtroom was packed to strict maximum capacity. Local journalists, corporate watchdogs, and curious spectators filled the wooden gallery benches, eagerly awaiting the final destruction of a man who once paraded himself as the pinnacle of local real estate development. I sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit. I sat perfectly still, radiating the quiet, unbroken discipline of a man who had built a life with his own 2 hands. Jared sat at the defense table, but he was entirely unrecognizable. The custom Italian linen shirts and the arrogant, polished swagger were completely gone. He wore an ill-fitting standard-issue suit provided by his depleted legal team. His skin was pale and sallow. Deep bruised shadows hung heavily under his eyes, the physical manifestation of half a year spent locked inside a federal holding facility without bail. He kept his head lowered, staring blankly at the polished wood of the defense table, profoundly aware that his father's vast wealth was no longer shielding him. His high-priced defense attorney stood up to deliver the opening statement. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to rewrite objective reality. The lawyer paced before the jury box, utilizing an exaggerated, soothing tone. He attempted to paint this entire federal ordeal as a highly complex, unfortunate family misunderstanding. I explicitly argued that Jared was a hyper-focused, aggressive businessman who simply moved too fast for standard protocols. The defense claimed the fraudulent collateral agreement and the bank submissions were mere administrative oversights exacerbated by a confused, overly hostile elderly father-in-law who fundamentally misunderstood modern corporate leveraging. It was a calculated narrative designed to generate reasonable doubt. It did not survive the morning. The lead federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium. She was a ruthless, meticulous attorney who operated strictly on undeniable facts. She did not raise her voice or employ cheap theatrical emotion. She systematically dismantled the defense's fabricated narrative piece by crushing peace. She turned to the jury and presented the initial bank fraud alerts. She displayed the highly magnified high-definition scans of the forged deed transfer. She clearly highlighted Jared's desperate attempt to pledge a residential property legally owned by Vanguard Holdings, proving absolute premeditated federal wire fraud across state lines. She methodically laid out his catastrophic financial insolvency, demonstrating exactly how a $2 million default drove him to criminal desperation. The prosecution did not stop at financial crimes. The prosecutor physically handed the jury the sworn signed confession transcripts from the 3 armed thugs arrested inside my reinforced hallway. She read aloud their explicit admission that a white real estate developer named Jared had hired them to execute a violent midnight home invasion in exchange for a cut of non-existent vintage gold. Jared physically shrank into his chair as his hired muscle's testimonies echoed through the cavernous courtroom. Then the prosecutor introduced the ultimate inescapable weapon. She connected her laptop to the courtroom audio system and played the raw, unedited audio recording of the burner phone call. The pristine acoustics of the federal building amplified Jared's manic, desperate voice. The jury sat in stunned, breathless silence. They listened to the defendant actively extort $2 million from his father-in-law. They heard him viciously threaten to doctor digital metadata to frame his own wife for federal wire fraud if his ransom demands were not met immediately. The prosecutor turned the audio off and looked directly at the defense table. She stated firmly that this was not a misunderstanding regarding aggressive business practices. She declared it was a calculated, violent conspiracy orchestrated by a predatory fraudster attempting to steal a lifetime of honest labor from the senior citizen. Desperation breeds severe tactical errors. The defense attorney realized he was rapidly losing the jury. The overwhelming mountain of physical and digital evidence was suffocating his client. He frantically pivoted his strategy, opting to launch a vicious character assassination against me. He approached the center of the courtroom and pulled a crisp medical document from his briefcase. He aggressively brought up the morning of the fake surrender at my house. He presented the preliminary psychiatric evaluation form that Kendra and Jared had threatened me with. The defense attorney loudly claimed to the jury that I was an inherently unreliable witness and a deeply paranoid individual. He argued that I was actively suffering from severe dementia-induced delusions. He spun a wild theory that my failing mind made me irrationally hostile toward my daughter's husband. He suggested I engineered this entire elaborate trap strictly because my deteriorating cognitive state convinced me that Jared was stealing from me. He attempted to weaponize the societal stereotype of a confused, fragile old man, hoping the jury would invalidate my meticulously gathered evidence based on a fabricated medical diagnosis. I sat in the gallery and did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of outrage. I simply watched the defense attorney blindly dig a catastrophic hole in front of a federal judge. The federal prosecutor slammed her hand onto her desk, shouting a fierce, immediate objection. She approached the bench with a heavy sealed folder. She completely destroyed the defense's psychiatric claim with a single devastating revelation. She presented undeniable federal flight records and an active Interpol tracking warrant. She informed the judge and the jury that the private doctor who supposedly authored that psychiatric evaluation had never actually conducted a medical exam on me. She revealed that the physician was heavily bribed by Jared to sign a fraudulent involuntary hold. The prosecutor announced that the corrupt doctor had officially fled the state 2 months ago to avoid a massive federal indictment for medical fraud and racketeering. The defense's entire character assassination collapsed instantly into absolute dust. The defense attorney stood frozen, his credibility entirely obliterated. To deliver the final inescapable blow to the defense, the prosecution called their star witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Kendra walked down the center aisle. She wore a simple professional suit. She did not look at the defense table. She walked with the cold, hardened resolve of a woman fully prepared to testify against the monster she married. Kendra stepped up to the wooden enclosure of the witness stand. She raised her right hand, swore the binding oath, and took her seat. She kept her posture perfectly straight. She completely refused to cast a single glance toward the defense table where Jared sat. The federal prosecutor approached the podium and began a precise chronological line of questioning. Kendra answered every single inquiry with cold, unwavering clarity. She painted a devastating, highly detailed picture of her hollow marriage. She recounted the exact events of the backyard barbecue. She told the jury how Jared intentionally shoved me into the scorching cast-iron grill to forcibly coerce a property transfer. She described the intense daily financial manipulation she endured behind closed doors. She explained how Jared aggressively coerced her into signing as the primary guarantor for his heavy equipment loans, fully intending to leave her holding an $800,000 deficit. She detailed the absolute ruin of her personal credit, describing the terrifying moment she stood in my study and saw her bank accounts completely drained to zero. The courtroom remained in dead silence as she delivered the final crushing piece of her testimony. She testified about finding the hidden canvas duffel bag in their apartment closet. She described the thick banded stacks of cash, the forged second passport, and the one-way first-class flight itinerary to Belize. She looked directly at the jury and stated clearly that her husband had meticulously orchestrated a plan to flee the country and submit doctored digital evidence to federal investigators to frame her for his entire wire fraud conspiracy. She did not shed a single tear. She delivered the absolute truth with the hardened resolve of a woman who had survived total financial and emotional devastation. The defense attorney practically leaped out of his chair the moment the prosecutor concluded her questioning. He was desperate to salvage his rapidly disintegrating case. He approached the witness stand with aggressive, predatory body language. He launched a vicious, calculated attack aimed entirely at destroying Kendra's character. He raised his voice aggressively, accusing my daughter of being a shallow gold digger who happily enjoyed the fruits of Jared's labor when the money was flowing. He painted her as a materialistic opportunist who gladly wore designer clothes and drove luxury cars without ever questioning where the funds originated. He aggressively pointed his finger at her, claiming she was a highly educated woman who fully understood the commercial loan documents she signed. He accused her of being a willing and active co-conspirator in the massive bank fraud. He shouted that she was now spinning a fabricated narrative of victimhood purely to save her own skin. He claimed she was ruthlessly throwing her innocent, hardworking husband under the bus to secure a favorable immunity deal with the federal prosecutors and avoid a mandatory prison sentence herself. Kendra did not flinch. The arrogant, materialistic woman from the barbecue was completely dead, and the defense attorney's aggressive tactics held absolutely no power over her newly forged spine. She leaned forward into the microphone. She calmly stated that her previous ignorance regarding her husband's finances was a profound personal failure, but it was not a federal crime. She refused to let him twist her realization into a conspiracy. When the lawyer loudly demanded proof that she was not the mastermind attempting to frame Jared, Kendra delivered a flawless counterstrike. She firmly reminded the defense attorney of the undeniable audio recording captured inside the private bank vault. She pointed out that the jury had already heard Jared's own voice on a hot microphone explicitly confessing to his entire fraudulent scheme. She reminded the courtroom that Jared had arrogantly boasted about using her as a disposable shield and mocked her intelligence while actively trying to steal $5 million. She looked the defense attorney dead in the eye and stated that she did not need to throw Jared under the bus because he had confidently driven it over himself. The defense lawyer deflated, realizing he could not bully a woman who had already survived hitting absolute rock bottom. He returned to his table in bitter defeat. The prosecutor called me as the final witness for the government. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps. I took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down. I looked out over the packed gallery, the jury box, and finally directly at Jared. I sat like a rock of absolute stoicism. The prosecutor asked me to describe the physical altercation on my backyard patio. I did not offer a dramatic or emotional recounting. I simply raised my right hand and held it up for the entire jury to see. The thick, permanent, shiny scar tissue stretched aggressively across my palm and fingers. I stated clearly that this permanent disfigurement was the exact price my son-in-law believed he had the right to extract for a piece of real estate. I spoke with absolute unwavering clarity about the fundamental difference between building true wealth and orchestrating a hollow theft. I told the jury that I spent 35 years working grueling double shifts on freezing industrial construction sites. I built my corporate portfolio through patience, extreme discipline, and honest backbreaking labor. I explained that Jared represented the exact opposite of that integrity. He was a man who believed a tailored suit and a forged signature entitled him to steal a lifetime of someone else's hard work. I stated that true power is built brick by brick over decades, while false empires built on deceit and violence inevitably collapse the moment they are aggressively tested. My words resonated through the silent courtroom with the heavy weight of undeniable truth. Listening to my calm, unwavering truth completely shattered the last remaining fragment of Jared's fragile ego. He could not handle the quiet superiority of a man he fundamentally viewed as beneath him. He violently lost his temper right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. He slammed his fists onto the defense table and leaped to his feet. He screamed vicious, unfiltered insults directly at me, his face turning an angry, mottled red. He roared that I was a pathetic old laborer who got lucky, shouting that he deserved my properties far more than I did. Two heavy-set federal bailiffs immediately rushed the defense table. Jared physically struggled against them, thrashing his shoulders and fighting the physical restraint. He completely proved his violent, highly unstable, predatory nature directly to the shocked jury. The federal judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the chaos as he ordered Jared permanently removed from the courtroom for severe contempt. The bailiffs forcibly dragged the screaming, cursing developer through the side doors. The heavy silence rushed back into the room. The judge instructed the jury to retire to their chambers and begin their final deliberations. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the jury inside their deliberation chambers. The sudden absence of noise left a ringing void in my ears. I walked slowly down the long, sterile corridor of the federal building and took a seat on a hard, polished wooden bench. Kendra sat down beside me. The physical toll of the trial had completely stripped away the last remaining traces of the affluent socialite she had desperately tried to become. She wore a simple, unbranded black suit. She stared blankly at the scuffed linoleum floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. We sat in absolute silence for the first hour. The agonizing wait for a federal verdict is a profound psychological torture for the guilty, but for us, it was a necessary purgatory. We were simply waiting for the legal system to officially stamp the death certificate of her hollow marriage. Kendra finally broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance and entitlement. She turned to me, her eyes red and hollow. She asked if her life was permanently destroyed. She wanted to know if she would ever be able to fix the massive, catastrophic wreckage she had helped create. She confessed that her credit was entirely ruined. Her social circle had completely abandoned her, and she was terrified of the crushing debt and the overwhelming stigma of being married to a convicted federal felon. She looked at me not as a burden to be managed, but as the only solid foundation left in her rapidly collapsing universe. She asked if there was any way to rebuild from absolute zero. I did not offer her a warm, comforting platitude. I did not wrap my arm around her shoulder or promise her that I would magically erase her financial burdens with my hidden wealth. I looked directly at my daughter and delivered the brutal, unvarnished truth. I told her that hitting absolute rock bottom is the most solid, reliable foundation a person can ever use to rebuild their character. I explained that the luxury cars, the designer handbags, and the sprawling penthouses were never real. They were a highly toxic synthetic illusion, built on a foundation of leveraged debt and criminal deceit. I told her that she had been infected by Jared's parasitic greed, fundamentally confusing the appearance of wealth with the substance of actual value. I held up my scarred right hand, the thick, shiny burned tissue serving as a permanent testament to the cost of defending one's dignity. I reminded her that I built a massive commercial real estate portfolio, not by scamming banks or leveraging fake assets, but by sweating through grueling double shifts in the freezing Chicago winters. I hauled heavy copper wiring until my joints ached and saved every single honest dollar I earned. I told Kendra that the only known cure for the profound entitlement she had adopted was severe, unrelenting hard work. I assured her that honest, backbreaking labor would actively cleanse the toxic arrogance from her system. I promised her that I would never bail her out or pay off her legal fines, but I would stand firmly beside her as she worked a blue-collar job and paid back every single cent she owed to society. I told her she was going to learn the precise, undeniable value of a single dollar earned through legitimate sweat. She did not argue. She did not complain or ask for an easier path. She looked at my scarred hand, nodded with a newfound hardened resolve, and accepted the grueling terms of her own redemption. The sharp, authoritative voice of the federal bailiff suddenly shattered the quiet intimacy of the hallway. He announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The deliberation had taken less than 4 hours, a remarkably swift conclusion that signaled absolute unified certainty. We stood up from the wooden bench and walked back into the cavernous courtroom. I took my seat in the front row. Jared was brought back in through the side holding door. He looked entirely broken. The frantic, explosive rage he had displayed earlier was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He sat at the defense table, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the empty jury box. The heavy wooden door at the rear of the chamber opened, and the 12 jurors filed silently into their seats. They did not look at the defense table. They did not look at Jared. The federal judge instructed the defendant to stand and face the jury. Jared pushed himself up on shaking legs. The judge asked the jury foreman if they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreman stood up, holding a crisp stack of papers. He spoke with a clear, echoing resonance. On the charge of federal wire fraud across state lines, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated forgery, guilty. On the charge of elder abuse and physical assault, guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of extortion and blackmail, guilty. Each word struck the quiet room like a precise, devastating hammer blow. The prosecution had achieved a flawless, undeniable victory. Jared's hollow empire was officially legally obliterated. The federal judge did not delay the inevitable. He possessed the immediate authority to issue the final mandate based on strict federal sentencing guidelines. He looked down at Jared with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The judge explicitly condemned Jared's highly predatory nature, his profound lack of remorse, and his violent, calculated actions toward a senior citizen. He stated that manipulating a federal financial institution was a severe crime, but attempting to physically and psychologically destroy a family member for pure financial gain demonstrated a fundamentally irredeemable character. The judge raised his wooden gavel. He sentenced Jared to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, explicitly stripping away any possibility of early parole. The heavy gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp, explosive crack. The trial was officially over. 2 federal bailiffs stepped directly behind Jared. They did not handle him with care. The heavy steel chains rattled loudly against the quiet tension of the courtroom. The cuffs locked securely around his wrists, attaching to a thick waist chain that forced his arrogant posture into a permanent, humiliating slump. Jared's custom-tailored life was officially over, replaced by standard-issue prison denim and the cold, unyielding reality of a 15-year federal sentence without the possibility of early parole. He shuffled heavily toward the side, exit his designer shoes dragging uselessly across the polished wood floor. Just before reaching the heavy oak doors, he stopped and turned his head. His hollow, bloodshot eyes met mine across the crowded gallery. He did not yell this time. The frantic, manic energy had been completely extinguished by the judge's gavel. In that singular, silent exchange, I watched the profound realization wash over his pale, defeated face. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of his fatal mistake. He realized that the quiet 70-year-old black man he had shoved into a searing grill was not a disposable obstacle or a senile target. I was the absolute architect of his total destruction. He had spent his entire adult life leveraging fake wealth and exploiting vulnerable people, assuming his privilege made him inherently untouchable. He had walked blindly into a meticulously constructed trap designed by a man who spent 35 years wiring high-voltage industrial grids. He learned the hardest lesson of his life much too late. The heavy doors swung open, swallowing him into the sterile concrete bowels of the federal justice system. He was gone, erased from our lives with absolute finality. I remained seated in the gallery, my breathing steady, feeling the heavy, oppressive weight of the past year completely lift from my shoulders. 6 months passed with the slow, deliberate pace of true healing. The dust from the federal indictments and the public scandal finally settled. The sprawling luxury apartment Kendra once shared with her convicted husband was seized and liquidated by the commercial banks. She officially filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy, surrendering every piece of designer clothing, every luxury vehicle, and every hollow symbol of her former affluent life. The most remarkable part of her transition was her strict silence. She did not call me crying. She did not ask me for a financial handout or a secret bailout from Vanguard Holdings. She understood that my protection during the trial was my final act of unconditional rescue. From that point forward, her survival was entirely her own responsibility. She secured a small, affordable one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. The rent was cheap, the heating was inconsistent, and the walls were thin, but it was honest. Kendra took a blue-collar administrative job at a local logistics warehouse managing freight manifests and dispatching truck drivers on the graveyard shift. She traded her high-end corporate luncheons for packing a simple lunchbox and clocking in before dawn. The grueling, relentless nature of the work served as a necessary crucible. Every paycheck she earned went directly toward basic survival and slowly paying off the remaining legal fines she incurred during the fraud investigation. She was exhausted, her hands calloused from filing paperwork and gripping steering wheels, but the toxic, parasitic greed that had nearly destroyed her soul was actively being burned away. I watched from a secure distance, utilizing my private investigators to ensure she was physically safe, but I never intervened financially. I allowed her to feel the full, crushing weight of total independence. She had to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet, without a man's fraudulent wealth or her father's secret safety net propping her up. The synthetic illusion of her past was completely dead, and the gritty, undeniable reality of her present was forcing her to forge a brand new spine. She was finally becoming the resilient, honorable woman I had tried to raise decades ago. Our relationship rebuilt itself in the quiet, unassuming spaces of a Sunday afternoon. Kendra began visiting my house every week without fail. She did not arrive in a flash of arrogance or demanding attention. She pulled into my driveway in a battered used sedan she had purchased with hard cash from her warehouse job. She walked through my front door carrying brown paper bags filled with groceries she had paid for, using her own honest wages. We sat together in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and preparing simple, quiet meals. The conversations were entirely stripped of the fake luxury and exhausting pretense that used to dominate our interactions. We did not discuss offshore accounts, real estate developments, or exclusive country club memberships. We talked about the hard realities of her work week, the difficult dispatch routes she managed, and the simple satisfaction of paying a utility bill on time. It was an incredibly difficult transition. There were moments of profound, uncomfortable silence where the ghosts of her past choices hung heavily in the air between us. But neither of us backed away from the discomfort. We faced it with genuine respect and absolute accountability. She never once complained about her new grueling life. She never asked me to open my safe or transfer funds to ease her burden. She fully understood that earning my respect was vastly more valuable than accessing my bank accounts. For the first time in 10 years, I was not looking at a spoiled socialite pretending to be superior. I was looking at my actual daughter grounded in reality and taking accountability for her own survival. I stepped out onto the back patio as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. The brick pathway was meticulously clean. The old cast-iron grill where Jared had violently shoved me was entirely gone. In its place stood a new massive industrial smoker I had purchased for myself. I ran my right hand over the smooth, cool metal of the heavy lid. The thick, shiny scar tissue stretched aggressively across my palm and wrapped tightly around my fingers. The permanent disfigurement was undeniable, but it did not hurt anymore. It had completely healed into a tough, leathery shield. I looked at the scar and reflected on the entire brutal ordeal. Modern society holds a deeply flawed, inherently dangerous assumption. People look at gray hair, slightly slower steps, and quiet demeanors, and they automatically view the elderly as weak or completely disposable. They assume age equates to a fundamental loss of sharp intelligence and capability. They completely forget that old men like me survived a world far harsher and far more unforgiving than the current sanitized era. I spent decades navigating corrupt union bosses, freezing industrial work sites, and systemic racial prejudice. I learned how to build massive empires in absolute silence, and how to dismantle predators without breaking a sweat. Jared mistook my chosen humility for severe vulnerability, and that fatal miscalculation cost him his entire existence. I walked over to the small wooden table resting under the shade of the oak tree. I picked up a heavy crystal glass and poured myself a generous measure of aged single malt whiskey. The amber liquid caught the fading golden light of the setting sun perfectly. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the pleasant, sharp burn slide down my throat. The evening air was crisp and perfectly still. There were no loud, arrogant voices demanding my property. There were no desperate, fraudulent schemes threatening my peace. There was only the absolute unbroken silence of a life fiercely defended. I had humbled my daughter, protected my house, and permanently caged a monster. I raised my glass to the empty, quiet yard, savoring the absolute victory of a man who demands and receives exactly what he is owed. I stood in the center of the sprawling penthouse suite that once served as the hollow throne room of my son-in-law's fraudulent empire. The floor-to-ceiling windows still offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline, but the interior was completely stripped of its synthetic luxury. The imported mahogany desks, the leather executive chairs, and the ostentatious art pieces had been seized, auctioned, and liquidated by the federal bankruptcy courts. The massive room was reduced to bare concrete and exposed steel beams. It looked exactly like the abandoned toxic industrial lots I purchased decades ago when no one else saw their value. I did not lease this premium commercial space to another flashy corporate developer. I instructed Harvey to convert the entire top floor of the plaza into a heavily subsidized vocational training center for young, underprivileged tradesmen. I brought in retired master electricians, seasoned commercial plumbers, and veteran union carpenters to teach a brand new generation the undeniable concrete value of physical labor. We replaced the shredded financial ledgers with architectural blueprints and heavy spools of copper wiring. I watched a young man from my old neighborhood successfully wire a complex high-voltage circuit board on his very first attempt. He possessed a raw, hungry discipline that Jared severely lacked. True power is not inherited through a secret offshore trust fund, and it is certainly not projected through a tailored designer suit bought on credit. True power is forged by mastering a tangible, essential skill that society fundamentally relies upon to function. I transformed a monument to toxic leveraged greed into an impenetrable fortress of practical life-saving education. The harsh winter arrived in the city, bringing freezing, brutal winds that tested the structural integrity of every building and the mental endurance of every resident. Kendra faced her first severe season working the graveyard dispatch shift at the local logistics warehouse. She no longer possessed the luxury of a heated underground parking garage or a remote starter for a luxury European vehicle. She stood in the biting cold every morning at 4 o'clock, using a cheap plastic scraper to remove the thick sheets of ice from the windshield of her battered, reliable sedan. One particular Tuesday, a severe, unexpected blizzard completely paralyzed the regional transit routes. The warehouse manager offered the administrative staff the immediate option to clock out early and avoid the highly dangerous roads. Kendra firmly refused the offer. She stayed at her dispatch desk for 14 consecutive hours, manually rerouting heavy freight trucks and ensuring emergency medical supply lines remained open and active. She navigated angry, exhausted drivers, failing communications grids, and her own sheer physical exhaustion. When she finally clocked out and walked to her car, her hands were entirely numb and her back ached with a profound, unfamiliar stiffness. She drove her sedan straight through the unplowed streets directly to my house. She did not complain about the freezing temperatures or the grueling nature of the warehouse work. She walked into my kitchen, dropped a modest canvas bag of groceries on my island, and handed me a printed stamped receipt. She had successfully paid off the final crippling installment of her court-mandated legal fines. She accomplished this monumental financial task using absolutely zero external assistance. She looked at me with exhausted, bloodshot eyes, and for the very first time in her adult life, she possessed the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a woman who fully owned her own existence. She had actively and painfully burned away the profound entitlement that nearly destroyed her. This grueling journey revealed a secondary, deeply profound lesson that extends far beyond the immediate destruction of a greedy, arrogant predator. Society constantly peddles a highly dangerous, fundamentally flawed narrative regarding generational wealth. Financial institutions, media, conglomerates, and cultural influencers aggressively push the toxic idea that leaving a massive pile of liquid cash for your descendants is the ultimate hallmark of a successful life. They are catastrophically wrong. Handing unearned massive wealth to a mind that has never experienced the crushing weight of genuine adversity is akin to handing a loaded firearm to a blindfolded child. It does not secure their future in any meaningful way. It virtually guarantees their eventual spectacular destruction. Money is nothing more than a ruthless, indiscriminate amplifier. It severely magnifies the foundational character of the person holding it. When you inject massive capital into a psychological foundation, built on arrogance, entitlement, and a profound lack of basic human empathy, you breed monsters exactly like Jared. You breed dangerous individuals who truly believe a forged signature and a polished aesthetic grant them the absolute right to shove an elderly man into a scorching cast-iron grill. The true indestructible asset a father must pass down to his children is not a diversified corporate stock portfolio or a stack of luxury real estate deeds. The ultimate vital inheritance is generational wisdom. It is the strict, unyielding installation of personal accountability. It is the mental and physical capacity to endure severe hardship without ever surrendering one's moral compass. I had to let my own daughter lose absolutely everything to ensure she gained the only thing that actually mattered. I had to let the federal government freeze her joint bank accounts. I had to let her hit the absolute unforgiving concrete of rock bottom. If I had shielded her from the brutal consequences of her choices, I would have permanently crippled her ability to survive in a hostile, predatory world. By forcing her to rebuild her shattered life with her own calloused hands, I gave her a suit of armor that no commercial bank or corrupt developer can ever repossess or leverage. She now understands with absolute clarity that a quiet conscience and a clean, honest ledger hold infinitely more value than an offshore shell account. While Kendra forged her new character in the freezing warehouses of the city, Jared experienced the stark, inescapable reality of his own choices inside the concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. His 15-year sentence offered no leniency, no early parole, and absolutely no preferential treatment. The federal justice system does not care about a man's former country club memberships or his past ability to secure commercial bridge loans. Behind those heavy steel doors, Jared was reduced to a simple, heavily monitored number. He spent his days scrubbing the cafeteria floors and his nights confined to a tiny, windowless cell. The profound isolation forced him to confront the absolute emptiness of his own character. He had built his entire identity on the perception of dominance and the exploitation of vulnerable targets. Stripped of his forged documents and his hired muscle, he was nothing but a hollow shell of a man, entirely consumed by his own monumental failure. He attempted to file multiple desperate appeals, writing frantic letters to his former corporate associates, begging for high-level legal intervention. Every single letter was returned unopened. His wealthy, politically connected father completely disowned him to protect the remnants of his own fractured empire. Jared learned the hardest, most brutal truth of the criminal underworld. Loyalty purchased with stolen money evaporates the exact second the money stops flowing. He was left entirely alone with the crushing, inescapable weight of his 15-year reality. Harvey finalized the complete legal absorption of Jared's shattered assets by the end of the fiscal year. Vanguard Holdings officially liquidated the remaining shell companies and aggressively redistributed the recovered capital. I did not keep a single cent of the liquidated funds for my own portfolio. I instructed Harvey to track down every single blue-collar contractor Jared had systematically scammed over the past 5 years. The independent plumbers, the union roofers, and the framing crews who had been completely stiffed by Jared's fraudulent bankruptcy filings received full comprehensive restitution with interest. I made absolutely certain that the very working-class people Jared openly despised were made entirely whole using his own stolen leveraged capital. The corporate litigator sat across from me in my quiet study, handing me the final heavy-sealed dossier of the federal fraud case. He asked me if I believed the war was finally over. I took the thick file and locked it securely inside my newly installed biometric steel safe. I looked at the lawyer who had stood by my side through the entire brutal conflict. I told him the war against corporate greed and human arrogance is never permanently won, but this specific violent battle was decisively and permanently concluded. The predators had been locked in federal cages, the synthetic illusions had been entirely shattered, and the natural order of respect had been ruthlessly restored. We did not toast to unearned wealth or corporate dominance. We poured 2 glasses of aged whiskey and toasted to the sheer, undeniable power of consequence. I stepped out onto the back patio as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. The brick pathway was meticulously clean. The old cast-iron grill where Jared had violently shoved me was entirely gone. In its place stood a new massive industrial smoker I had purchased for myself. I ran my right hand over the smooth, cool metal of the heavy lid. The thick, shiny scar tissue stretched aggressively across my palm and wrapped tightly around my fingers. The permanent disfigurement was undeniable, but it did not hurt anymore. It had completely healed into a tough, leathery shield. I looked at the scar and reflected on the entire brutal ordeal. Modern society holds a deeply flawed, inherently dangerous assumption. People look at gray hair, slightly slower steps, and quiet demeanors, and they automatically view the elderly as weak or completely disposable. They assume age equates to a fundamental loss of sharp intelligence and capability. They completely forget that old men like me survived a world far harsher and far more unforgiving than the current sanitized era. I spent decades navigating corrupt union bosses, freezing industrial work sites, and systemic racial prejudice. I learned how to build massive empires in absolute silence and how to dismantle predators without breaking a sweat. Jared mistook my chosen humility for severe vulnerability, and that fatal miscalculation cost him his entire existence. I walked over to the small wooden table resting under the shade of the oak tree. I picked up my heavy crystal glass. The amber liquid caught the fading golden light of the setting sun perfectly. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the pleasant, sharp burn slide down my throat. The evening air was crisp and perfectly still. There were no loud, arrogant voices demanding my property. There were no desperate, fraudulent schemes threatening my peace. There was only the absolute, unbroken silence of a life fiercely defended. I had humbled my daughter, protected my house, and permanently caged a monster. I raised my glass to the empty, quiet yard, savoring the absolute victory of a man who demands and receives exactly what he is owed. If my story resonated with you, I need you to understand that defending your peace is never an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate act of survival. Never allow anyone, regardless of their title or their relation to you, to mistake your kindness for weakness. Stand your ground, secure your assets, and let the predators dig their own graves. Tell me in the comments below a time you had to enforce a brutal boundary to protect your own life from a toxic family member. Hit the like button to support stories of uncompromising justice and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another lesson in absolute resilience.